like a video sound. You said the legislative video. You know what's missing in a lot of our conversations?
All right, good morning, good morning, good morning. We're going to start with our program this morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Fantastic. We at church now. Good morning. Good morning. All right, peace and blessings, everyone. My name is Adam Jackson. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle here in Baltimore. And I want to welcome you to our 2022 Black Legislative Agenda Day. Give a clap for that. So today's going to be lots of information about what is happening in the upcoming Maryland General Assembly. And before we get into the actual conversation about legislation and all the wonderful things that are associated with advocacy for Black people in this town, we want to start off with libations. Is anyone familiar with libations? Raise your hand if you're familiar with libations. All right. So one of the reasons why, LBS, we're a Pan-African organization, explicitly Pan-African, we advocate for Black people. And one of the things that we see as necessary to do the work that we do is to make sure that we not just talk about the people in the here and now, but that we also bring in the ancestral energy that is necessary to advocate for our community. And so one of the things I wanted to do this morning, notice up here on the stage, there is a plant and some water. And so for people who are unfamiliar with libations, the purpose of the ceremony and the practice is to bring in the energy of not just our ancestors and our bloodline, but also ancestors from people of our national heroes and sheroes, people who have impacted our community in a real positive way. And so, typically what happens in libations, we, in certain contexts, we ask the elder in the room if we have permission to continue with libations. And so, with your permission, I also want to ask who is the elder in this particular room. So I'll just kind of go through. So anybody in their 50s and older, raise your hand. Okay, 60 or older, raise your hand. 70 or older, raise your hand. Fantastic, I love it. 80 or older. Okay, so 70 and older. Okay, so who of you is the elder in the room? Bobby, what's your name?
Samuel Jordan.
And what's your age, brother?
I'm 76.
Yes, sir. Let's sign up, brother. Samuel. All right, so we also want to get the youngest in the room, so 20 or younger. All right. What's your name, brother?
Jalen. Jalen.
Jalen?
Yes.
And what's your age?
12.
12. Let's clap it up for brother Jalen being here this morning. So I'm going to ask brother Samuel, do we have permission to continue to do libations this morning? So that's Samuel right here.
Yes, I call on my ancestors as well to make certain that we are covered and blessed in our procedure this morning.
Absolutely. And so asking, do we have permission?
Do we have permission?
You do have my permission.
Yes, sir. Fantastic. All right. So, matter of fact, Dayvon, you come up here and just hold the microphone. So after we pour water into the plant, the reason why we pour water into the plant is to create life-generating energy. That is the purpose of libations, to not just talk about our ancestors and speak their name, but to create the energy in which they can be present with us in this very moment. So every time we pour water, we say the word Ashe. Okay? We say it together. Let's say it together.
Ashe.
Fantastic. Ashe is similar to amen. It means let it be. So you can say, when we say Ashe, let it be. And so at the very end of that libations, we say Ashe 3 times. And then we finish the libation ceremony. So we begin. We give thanks and honor to the Creator, the one we call God, the creator of all things, and we say,
Ashe.
We give thanks for those who sit at the feet of God, who sit with our Creator, who have passed on to the other side, and we say,
Ashe.
We give thanks and honor to our ancestors buried in the soil of Africa, and we say,
Ashe.
We give thanks and honor to the ancestors who died in the Great Ma'afa, the transatlantic slave trade. Their sacrifice was not in vain, and we say,
Ashe.
So at this moment, at this time, we want to give thanks and honor to ancestors in our personal bloodline. We also talk about our national heroes and sheroes, but the people in our bloodline brought us here today. And so we want to say their names as we pour libations. I'll start with my grandmother, Doris Jackson, and you just call out the name of your ancestors as well. So Doris Jackson.
Ashe. Corinne Davis.
Go ahead. Ashe.
Ashe.
Lennox Flanagan.
Ashe.
Ashe.
Fred Hampton.
Ashe. 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 So at this time, we want to give thanks and honor to our national heroes and sheroes, the people that we know nationally, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, who have brought us here today. I'll start Parent Mitchell.
Shirley Chisholm.
Ashe.
Davis Ransom.
Ashe. George Mitchell. Call their name, national hero and sheroes.
Ella Baker,
Ashe.
Elijah Muhammad,
Ashe.
Muhammad,
Ashe.
Marcus Garvey,
Ashe.
Malcolm X,
Ashe.
Osaka Fortune,
Ashe.
Huey Newton.
Ashe.
Tupac.
Ashe.
Biggie.
So now we want to move to,
Alvin Butts,
we want to give thanks and honor to those who are yet unborn. We give thanks to those who await justice, and we say Ashe 3 times.
Ashe. Ashe. Ashe.
The libation is complete. I'm going to use this plan up here to represent, because that's not just words. This is a practice to bring in the energy of our ancestors. I want to thank you for participating in that this morning. So again, we'll have a really packed conversation this afternoon, and I want to actually first bring up Tanay Lynn Harris. Am I right about that? Dayvon? Yes, we are. So Tanay Lynn Harris represents the Bloom Collective, and so she's going to start us off with a conversation about the work that the Bloom Collective does here in Baltimore. I want you to clap it up for Tanay to talk about her work this morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So as Ali said, my name is Tanay Lynn Harris. I am the director, co-founder of the Bloom Collective. We are situated here in Baltimore City, and we also opened up a new office in Howard County as well. So we are a reproductive health rights and justice and maternal health organization. We do work from preconception, pregnancy, to postnatal care, That includes fertility and preconception, childbirth education, lactation, perinatal therapy, postpartum support groups, postnatal doula services and support. So when we're thinking about the particular trajectory of the work of folks like the Bloom Collective and so many others, locally and nationally and internationally, is really to look at what is reproductive justice. And oftentimes, as we're thinking about the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs case, a lot of people utilize the language of reproductive justice to only mean abortion.
Right.
It is an important part of, abortion is an important part of reproductive justice, but it's not the only thing.
Right.
And we really have to understand, when we're thinking about Black maternal health in particular, how people have utilized the Black maternal mortality and morbidity crisis as a linkage for them to get their money, but not actually to make any level of change and transformation that's needed in our community.
Right.
So I say that as just kind of a disclaimer to, for Bloom, I'll be completely honest with you, we do not know whether some of the policy and legislations that are going to be coming up in this new Maryland legislative session, but I'll give you an example of things and how things worked last year during the legislative session. One, as you all know, thinking about legislative sessions, they oftentimes want us to operate at high levels of silos, and they start to push a particular agenda of what it is that they want to see happen. So for example, one of the issues that came up last year during the legislative session was around the right to consent. And the right to consent is really what we're seeing is Black mothers, Black birthing folks are giving birth in hospitals and then are being drug tested without their own consent. Yes. There's this idea that within hospitals that there's universal testing, and we just know that that's not to be the case. Within this testing is you will see folks who might have CBD, THC, or any use of substance within their system. And what these hospitals do is they use it as a way to criminalize. So we start looking at CPS, we start looking at the foster care system, we start looking at adoptions, and really who does that begin to harm? And so all of these things are intertwined and connected. In 1992, it was 12 Black women who created and coined the term reproductive justice. And how interesting, majority of white organizations will utilize reproductive justice for their own self-gain.
Right.
We saw that happening in the overturn of Roe, where everyone was like, we do reproductive justice, send all the money here. Abortion care is important, but it's not the only thing. So one of the things that we really want to position and really uplift is when we're thinking about maternal health, reproductive justice, birthing folks, perinatal health, however utilization of the words that you want to, we are talking about doulas being in hospitals. But that is also the low-hanging fruit of really what's happening. Having birth doulas in hospitals is not going to change the systems and the structures at hand. And these organizations, foundation, and investment folks, they know that. Because that's the low-hanging fruit, So they're giving money to create and to certify more folks to become birth doulas. And here in Maryland, for example, there was a push for there to be doula reimbursement. They hired Black folks as lobbyists who were pushing it. But the actual money that birth doulas need, it isn't no $250 or $300 when really working with folks in the community. And so we really have to keep our eye and focus on those of us who are in the community, who are also paying attention to what's happening nationally. We're one of the picture partners with the Black Mamas Matter Alliance. This isn't a new phenomenon. We've just been doing the work to try to uplift and amplify what we've been known has been happening, right? And so what has happened is when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had enacted the proclamation around Black maternal health, everyone's now raising their hands saying that they're doing that work, including the American Heart Association. They've been that for the past year. But millions of dollars are going into these organizations and these agencies to really push their own particular agenda. And it's leaving those of us who are actually in the community, who are trying to create alternative systems of holistic care. We're really following the genealogy. We're really trying to continue in the genealogy of the grand midwives. My great-great-grandmother was a grand midwife in Seneca, South Carolina. That's the full wraparound services of contraceptive abortive care when our elders and our ancestors were being raped on a plantation. And then also to ensure that folks were getting the care that it is that they need, desire, and deserve. And so we didn't have white men in white coats at that time. We had the black women who were on the plantations and in our cities who were the ones who were really birthed this entire nation. And so for us, we're really trying to follow in that work, to continue to do that work, and that we do ask that whenever something comes up, when it pertains to maternal health, reproductive health rights and justice, perinatal health, that you really link arms and join those of us who are in the community. Check, verify, do you think this is the best course of action? If you see someone who is working on a particular policy, ask them, who are you connected to? What organizations and institutions that are rooted in community are they working with? Because oftentimes, they may have been hired to push a particular agenda. That could be the Maryland Health and Hospital Association. That could be the Maryland Department of Health. It could be the Baltimore City Department of Health. So all of these things can be working in opposition to the actual liberatory ways of doing this work. And it's also important to know we think that reproductive justice is literally just around health. Reproductive justice, as I like to uplift, is like how Dr. Ashon Crawley positions it as the otherwise possibilities. And really it is the everyday practice, not as a destination, but the everyday practice of how we build a world anew and how we really engage and interact with one another. And so reproductive justice issues are those that also make manifest in our schools. The fact that we don't have hot water, the fact that there's lead in the water, the fact that there's no ACs, no heat, unemployment, underemployment, interpersonal violence, but even we have to get to the question of why is there violence in the first place, right? So it's violent that people do not have the things that they need and they want and they deserve and they desire, which creates what we begin to see, right? And so those become reproductive justice issues because people say, I might not want to have children, and that's their choice, right? But if we have everything that we need to make the best decisions for our lives, how does that kind of help? And reproductive justice is not about women. It is for every single every single person. Life, reproductive justice directly affects.
All right. Let's give a round of applause to Tanay Lynn Harris. Ooh, here we go. All right. So also I just want to give a little context again for today's conversations. Because next up we have Grandpre from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. He'll be giving a presentation about reparations. But one thing that's going to happen, fantastic. One thing that's going to happen later on this afternoon is that there's going to be a conversation with Senator Jill P. Carter. She'll be here to actually talk with our moderator this afternoon, Ray Baker. And then there'll be a panel where we'll be talking about specific things that folks will be doing during the Maryland General Assembly. And so our intention here today is not just to share information, because there's going to be a lot of information shared this afternoon, but towards the end of our program, we want to make sure that everyone gets the opportunity to ask questions. And Ray will explain when he gets up to moderate how that's going to happen this afternoon. And we're going to be here, we're going to be here until 2 o'clock. So please get comfortable and get some sandwiches, because there's going to be lots of information shared. So we really appreciate you being here this afternoon. And one thing I will mention is that raise your hand in this room if you are a sustainer of LBS. Oh, that's a lot of people. Can somebody explain what is a sustainer for LBS?
I give monthly.
You give monthly, so the fact that this event happened, what was it, free to come here? I wonder how that happened. That's crazy. So people like Zakiya, Yanet, and other folks donate monthly to the organization. There are flyers available at the table where Candace is. You can scan your phone and become a sustainer of LBS. Most people give $10 a month. They already raised prices at Netflix. You can donate to that. So we appreciate you and thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm going to bring up Grandpre. He is our Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and we'll be talking about reparations. Put it up for him. We'll make sure everyone can hear Lauren, so when you start speaking, let them know if you can't hear.
Is this live?
Yeah, it's live stream.
Yeah, it's on you.
Yeah, can y'all hear me in the back? Yeah, coached the Bay for about 10, 15 years, so it's for moments like this and I need to project. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Grandpre. I'm Director of Research for Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle. I'm not going to talk too much about the details about our reparations bill. Maryland's going to legalize cannabis. You tax recreational cannabis. You want the tax money to go to the communities impacted by the war on drugs. That's the gist of it. I want to talk about the concept of reparations and why it's essential that we use the concept of reparations to frame this particular bill and why it's important to understand what that means. Because there's increasing talk about reparations, but there's not shared understanding about what that term means. So I want to read this quote. It's from Joel Crawford. Some of you might know these next few people, Wade Nobles and Joy DeGruy Leary. So two elder master teachers and scholars in our community. So they're writing about reparations. When we recall the sordid events of the past and just compensation thereof, it is clear that reparations cannot be reduced to a giant welfare check to assuage the guilty conscience of the perpetrators ere they continue to enjoy the spoils of that unjust enrichment. And while perhaps a sincere, symbolic, apologetic gesture on the part of some, a check cut to dispense to the descendants of the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, now free to spend and consume in a most likely white-oriented establishment. Making a few purchases or paying a few bills would hardly settle the gory 400-year score. The root word of reparations is repair. So it begs the question of what are we repairing to? I like this quote for a few reasons. First, it's from an article called Reparations in Healthcare for African Americans, Repairing the Damage from the Legacies of Slavery. So this article is very explicit about obviously the harms of slavery go far beyond what can be accounted for just investing in healthcare. But beyond a one-shot deal that deals with the legacy of slavery in the future, investing in systemic institutional investments to meet concrete needs in the community now is a necessary prerequisite for any future investment to actually deal with the legacy of slavery. So there is not a dichotomy between addressing the legacy of slavery and addressing things like the war on drugs. We're in fact creating a proof of concept that can build institutional power for future investments. So that's one of the reasons why I really like this. And the second reason is that it's very explicit. That's not about Black people integrating into existing institutions. It's about getting the money for us to build our own and for them to operate on the culture and traditions and expertise of the people who were actually aggrieved by the harm. So this is an excellent article. I recommend you read it because it framed how we conceptualize the work we did last session and will continue to do on the reparations bill. Thank you. We have a reparations problem. How did reparations go from being a third rail issue to being a mainstream issue in the Democratic Party? How did that happen? I submit to you that the definition of reparations has shifted over the past 70 to 100 years. Reparations used to be a paradigmatically Black nationalist pan-Africanist issue that was antagonistic to existing institutions in the Democratic Party. When Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, when that 2020 presidential campaign run, everybody had a reparations plan. Right. And almost all of it was about investing in incorporating and integrating Black people into existing white-led human social service institutions. So what we have here is what Derek Bell might call interest convergence, where the needs of Black people are being defined by how it can benefit white institutions and white power. And that's why people are getting to talk about reparations now. What we propose is something fundamentally different. We're asking the question, if root of reparations is repair, what are we repairing to? What existed before the harm? What existed before slavery? What existed before the war on drugs? So you start looking at things like agriculture. You start looking at things like not just Carter G. Woodson, crop rotation, the peanut, that increased the quality of the soil in the South. But looking at Pan-African, you look at places like Cuba. In the face of American sanctions, Cuba has an incredible agricultural system that runs without many of the industrial fertilizers that we have. And if you look at the South again, African people, when they were during slavery and during liberation from slavery, had gardening traditions, not just aesthetic gardening traditions, but to meet their material needs. And when white folks actually came to the South, they actually told them, we don't think these gardens look very pretty. You should change the gardens. And in the process of making them more aesthetically pleasing for white folks, they actually made them less efficient for Black folks, right? Look at education. Look at Timbuktu. Look at Fannie Jackson Coffin, sort of the history of independent Black schools here in Baltimore, Henry Highland Garnett, the African Academy, the Freedmen's Bureau, when Du Bois rights, when the Freedmen's Bureau brought money and teachers down to the South. Many of the indigenous Black teachers told them things like, yeah, you can give us the money, but we don't want your teachers. because we already have indigenous teaching traditions that we would want to actually foster. And what happened with integration? Derek Bell again tells us that they integrated some of the people into some of the schools, but they lost all the Black teachers. So we had this exodus of one of the pillars of the Black community. And lastly, look at something. Well, I'll just leave those two examples. So those are examples where integration into the white establishment actually hurt the ability for Black institutions to meet the needs of our people. That's why we have to be adamant to not accept definitions of reparations, including for the war on drugs, that limit our vision of reparations to being incorporated into existing systems just for more money. We have indigenous institutional systems that have to be fostered, and that's where the money has to be go, and that's how we wrote the bill. So the entire point of the bill is to actually create a fund where it doesn't just sit in the general fund, doesn't sit in the state capital of Annapolis. It goes back to the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. And just to kind of explain to you why this sort of thinking is so important, I want to just basically give you some of these numbers very quickly. So 30% of all the tax revenue generated by recreational cannabis will go to a fund reparative of the harm of the war on drugs. That's what we passed last session. We'll probably talk more about it later. But within that, that money will be distributed proportionately to localities based upon the amount of total cannabis arrests and incarcerations that locality produced during the period of time that cannabis was illegal. What does that mean? That means that even in a world where the Supreme Court is dominated by conservatives and they're adamantly striking down explicitly race-based reparative policies, we're able to disproportionately invest in communities not based upon stating the race of the people who are aggrieved, but by just demonstrating materially these communities were more harmed, so therefore they need to get more money. So this was a very intentional effort for us to account for these dynamics. So let's just run some of these numbers very quickly, because I think sometimes people feel like this is technocratic, this is so much less than the $1 trillion, HR 40 federal investment. But let's actually think about this. 6 million people in Maryland, 600,000 of them from Baltimore City. But let's be conservative, let's double it, because we know there were more people arrested in Baltimore than other places. So let's say 20% of this fund goes to Baltimore. How much money is that? 20% of the 30%. So there's no way to know how much money is going to be in cannabis total, but it's going to be a lot of money. It's going to be between $100 to $300 million a year Maryland's going to generate with cannabis taxation revenue. Let's take 200 million as the number. So 30% of 200 million is 60 million. So 10% of that would be 6 million, but you double it to 12 million. That means $12 million a year, every year. It's going to go not just to the general fund, but specifically dictated to go to communities in Baltimore City most impacted by the war on drugs. That means that over a course of 10 years, we're looking at potentially something in the range of $120 million investment in specifically the communities most impacted by the war on drugs in Baltimore City. And this is what we do with your sustainable money, is that we look at these opportunities, we crunch the numbers, and we strategically target our efforts to places like this that are strategically most impactful for our community. And this is why we have to push beyond not just reparations, but also thinking about criminal justice. Because in the last 90 seconds I have, we've heard some people, when we say war on drugs, they say, I'm tired of talking about criminal justice. Every time they talk about Black people, all they talk about is how we was locked up. Now we're not locked up no more. And what I think people are saying is that traditionally the Democratic Party, they'll give you expungement, they'll give you resentencing, they might give you some job training, but they won't give you the money and power to build and own anything yourself. And that's exactly what this is not. We are not the Justice Reinvestment Act. We are not what Biden did with the exonerations of limited numbers of small-scale possession offenses. This is not that. This is $120 million over 10 years, specifically targeted, not just to individuals, not just the people who were locked up, but to the communities, the fabrics of the communities that was targeted. The fabric was shredded. When people are selling drugs, they're not just individual people. They're paying rent. They're buying Pampers. They're a part of families and communities. So what are the types of things that we would study in like a local commission to study reparations for the war on drugs? It wouldn't just be individual people locked up. It will be things like, how did this impact Black business creation over this past 30 years? How did this impact vacancy rates in Baltimore? How did the war on drugs impact the ability for people to build families? how did the war on drugs impact the ability to have indigenous nonprofits versus exogenous nonprofits, people from outside of our community, claiming to work on our behalf and getting all that money for us? If we're studying that, we're expanding beyond this very individualistic, limited frame of criminal justice and towards a vision of community reparations. And unlike other states, we'll actually have a pot of money to do something about it. So this is why conceptually we must use the frame of reparations and must go beyond criminal justice and go beyond just thinking about the legacy of slavery to build institutional capacity for us to be able to use this unique opportunity to change the narrative of reparations from repairing the harm between the oppressor and oppressed to repairing the fabric of the communities of the oppressed so they no longer need the oppressors. So with that, thank you.
Well, matter of fact, since we're good on time right now, does anybody have, I know that Lawrence kind of had to make his way through that. For him and Tanay, matter of fact, does anyone have any questions about the Bloom Collective's work or the reparations piece? Yes.
Sure, for Lawrence.
Yeah.
So I get the concept. How are we gonna ensure that the distribution of those funds, when they come to our communities, actually go to these indigenous organizations in our community?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. There's nothing we can 100% do to make sure that all the money goes where we want it to be, because we're obviously a heterogeneous community. We've done some things in terms of designing it to repair what we saw as the limitations of other states. So Illinois is the example that gets most held up. Like if they want to co-opt this process in Maryland that we've started, they're going to try to sell us on what Illinois did. Illinois had all the money centralized in the state government. They had political appointees, including a few hand-selected returning citizens, on a panel that decided where these grants went. And they used criteria like, do you have a public health approach? Do you have 3 years of audited financial statements? Do you have, so basically it geared it towards the big nonprofits and nonprofit industrial complex. So what we've said instead is that we're not going to have the money centered in the state capital. We're going to make it so localities have to pass an ordinance that dictates at a local level, a county level, a city level, what is the process by which you are giving these funds out, and the funds cannot go to, for example, the police. They cannot go to replace already allocated spending, so you can't play the money shell game. And it has to go to broadly defined programming reparative of the harm of the war on drugs. We want to leave it broad because too often people limited to addiction services, workforce development, stuff that basically people have already, there's a pipeline of people in those networks that can colonize a lot of that money. And also a lot of people in our community, they may not want to do like even cannabis entrepreneurship. They may want to have a youth program. They may want to do other entrepreneurship. So keeping that money broad and putting it at a local level makes grassroots movements more powerful in pushing from a bottom up level the ability to push that money where we want to go. So, it's just at a pure numerical level, less people elect city council people than elect state senators. So your local power goes further at a local level than it does at the state level. So again, there's no guarantees on any of this. But the idea is that people in Baltimore City. If you want something in that bill, go to that councilman and tell them that's what you want. And also tell them what you don't want. And that's how we have to fight.
So one more question before we move on to the speaker. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if we talk about legislatively impacting what it is that we need and what it is that we want, you know that there will be strategies outside of our collective that will try to counteract in a way like redistricting.
Yeah.
Or something of that nature. I'm wondering how we will overcome those kinds of issues and objections.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is you all being here, you all being on our email listserv, because unfortunately, the devil is in the details when it comes to these bills. So whether it's in Annapolis or at the city council level, as we're pushing this bill, there can be moments where people who are not interested in this vision flourishing try to push back. Because one thing that we always say, like the work we've done with the youth fund and things like that, if the community can decide for itself who it funds and administer the funds itself, what do we need these foundations for? What do we need this whole industry of people telling us what's best for us? It's actually a threat to their livelihood and their jobs. So it's not a conspiracy theory, it's in people's material interest to basically not give people in community power, because if you all can operate with this money effectively, they don't have a job anymore. So it's not usually, they don't say you don't reserve reparations. They don't even say you all are incompetent. They try to slide in language in bills and in riders and reforms. They try to slide in people on panels who might not be as amenable to this perspective. And a lot of that is so subtle, they're not used to people pushing back when it happens, because they're used to being able to doing it and no one knowing what's going on. So people in this room, like when we send these email blasts out, asking you to call somebody or email somebody, we're not doing that just for the sake of doing it. We're doing it because we've deemed that strategically pushing in these particular places is going to give us the maximum amount of latitude and control over this money. Because again, like part of it is just the power of compound interest. People aren't seeing the value of this money the way that we're seeing it, which means that we've got a head start on pushing this fund where we want it to go. But once they start selling cannabis, people are going to say, where's the money going? Where's the money going? And that's going to come back and be like, oh, LBS did 3 years of work and try to push back against it. It's kind of what they did with the fund, right? So that's just one example of what we have to do.
Can I ask a question? Just one last question. Did LBS support the legalization of cannabis? Is that something that you supported?
For this reason. So recognizing that people can abuse cannabis, but also recognizing that legalization is inevitable, our theory was that if they're going to legalize it, we need to be part of the people pushing legalization to have the most maximum social justice, community empowerment framework for it. Because I'm not one of those people who says that cannabis can never do anything wrong. Like, I think you need to have community systems where if people are using cannabis to like medicate their own trauma or medicate their own self-hatred, there need to be people in community that can help deal with that. What's the best way to ensure that? I would say it's probably getting this fund and money in community where people in community can choose the type of people who are invested in it. So community-controlled addiction treatment, I think, is a necessary version of what needs to be paid for, and not just opioids, psychedelics, including cannabis, because all those things can take people from productive members of society and make them less productive, less fulfilled. And so, but we need institutional power and money to be able to deal with that. So that's why we did support cannabis legalization, because we knew we had to get in front of reframing the reparations part of the bill. Because otherwise, we would get our communities full of cannabis, but we wouldn't have the money to build a grassroots infrastructure to deal with any of the harm that could come with that.
Thank you, Lawrence. Let's give up a little bit more time. So we're going to move right now to the next part of our program with Brother Ray Baker, kind of a conversation with Senator Jill P. Carter, aka People's Champion. She's coming up to the front right now. And so this is the last time you'll probably hear from me until the end, but I just want to say again about this money thing. I mean, and money, like investing in LBS, like being a sustainer. This is have a seat right here. One of the reasons why we're able to do this, and this is our 8th year doing this event. We do it intentionally and on purpose because people so many times, how many times have we been in meetings where people say we need to have an agenda, we need to have a black agenda, and here's the black agenda today. And we're wondering, and the thing is, people want organizations like ours to exist and for us to do these types of things. And so when we say, oh, appreciate that, man. See, that's why you got folks in the village to adjust your cameras and do a stream live. But yeah, people say they want us to do these types of events and to have a legislative agenda and to talk about what it means to invest in Black people. And the way we do that is with our dollars and our resources. And so I just want to encourage you again, if you become a sustainer, your monthly donation supports free public educational events just like this. We're going to Annapolis, like it's not a theoretical, these are things that are not theoretical because some people can get real caught up in the verbiage and the language and the talking. We go to Annapolis January to April every year, and we advocate the things we're talking about. And so the people that you'll see in this panel later after Senator Carter and Ray talk this afternoon, they'll be talking about issues that they're working on in Annapolis this year. And the reason why we convene these talks is because we think it's important that Black people see other Black people working for Black people in real ways. And so invest in LBS, become a sustainer, sign up today. On that table, I might do it like we are in church. Somebody might have to raise their hand and say, I'll invest in LBS. Can somebody do that right now? I'll invest in LBS. Oh, 2, 3, 4, 5. We got 5? Okay, well, go to the table so you can talk about it. But thank you very much, and I'll pass it to Brother Ray Baker to get us into this conversation this afternoon, right?
Thank you kindly, Adam. Thank you everyone for having us out here. And give yourselves a round of applause to get started, please. Adam is very gracious in the introduction. My name is Ray Baker. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Towson University. I know some other folks from other types of organizing work I do around the city, and I just know other folks because we all Black and we know each other, right? So sometimes you say, hey, I know you. And nonetheless, it is my esteemed pleasure to be here and be in conversation with the People's Senator, Senator Jill Carter. Senator Carter, I'm going to turn the microphone. Yes, please. I'm going to give you the microphone after I do just a brief introduction, and then because folks are here to hear from you. In this conversation, we're going to identify two specific things. We're going to first continue what Lawrence gave us an outline of a little bit around the question of reparations and cannabis, right? We all knew how much cannabis was talked about on our ballots this past November, but once its implementation arrives at our front door, once we see that as a recreational pursuit, what does that look like legislatively? What have been some of the conversations that have been happening? We heard a little bit from Lawrence about what's been going on across the United States, but we're going to hear from the senator about what her experiences are, what her hopes are, and what she's going to work toward. Then we're going to hear from her about her legislative policies, her legislative priorities, and how we can be involved in those things. So, Senator, let me pass the microphone to you with this first question. Now that cannabis has been legalized on the ballot, now that we in this room are aware of the ways that we want to use cannabis for the purpose of reparations, what is it that you know from being a senator that we, the rest of us, the citizenry, should pay attention to this coming legislative session around cannabis and cannabis language and legislation?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you too, my constituent, Ray. Basically, cannabis, many of us know, first of all, let me just say hi. It's good to be here. It's good to see you all. Thanks for coming out in the not so great weather. And if you're from West Baltimore, as I am, the drive isn't all that great. It's nice to be in a room full of allies and friendly faces. So first, let me say, cannabis has always been legal for white people.
Right.
When you have 95% of the people that are being arrested and criminalized being Black people, then cannabis has already been legalized for white people. So just voting to have recreational cannabis legal is not a victory in and of itself. Unless we have policies, and I know the great guru on cannabis, my go-to person, Lawrence, spoke in depth about it, but I think that the victory is participation and opportunity and economic opportunity from the top down of the system. And so that begins with the top would be the licensing. There must be opportunity for people and individuals and communities to benefit from the very top level of the licensing. There are ways and schemes to do that, and I think that those are things that we've got to push for. And then I think also participation in all of the services that this industry generates, all of the materials and supplies and all the other services. And it has to be very intentional. It can't just be, we hope that we get a chance or there's lip service given to it. These things must be written in the law, and the law will be written this legislative session. The very base law that we passed last year was just to legalize it with a few things that it included, including some restrictions that I think we need to override in terms of like how many plants that people can grow at home. We need to also fix and override the fact that there should be, in my opinion, there should be no criminalization whatsoever for marijuana outside of the legal industry. So meaning that once it's legal, if a person were to violate, a regulation as to how they are to have it or not have it, they shouldn't be criminalized as a result of it, no matter what the quantity is. We have to fix the criminal justice aspects of it and be very serious about not just saying that the person can, get an expungement for a prior record, but we have to look at people that are still being criminalized and incarcerated or on parole or probation for an offense where marijuana was the precursor for that offense. We have a bill, and the ACLU and LDS has worked hard to help draft a bill to prohibit odor searches for law enforcement officers, meaning that just because they smell the odor of marijuana, that's no reason that they can go further with the search of an individual or a vehicle or anything like that. That's critically important. And I'll tell you, I think that these very specific details in legislation make or break whether or not legalizing cannabis is a victory or not. Without these things, simply putting in the law that it's legal, which it was always legal for certain people, is not in and of itself enough. I think that covers the bulk of it. So the licensing, the industry services, the ability to participate. Lawrence talked about the fund, which was one of the things that was included in last year's bill, but making sure that how that, as we go forward, how that's executed and implemented is actually in a way that meets our intended goals, which is always a struggle. I think that's it for that.
Senator, you talked about the participation services, the ways that we want to integrate there, and the word integrate is doing some work that I don't want it to do, but the ways that we are involved in those services. How can we write into the legislature ways that we ensure that our communities and the affected communities are involved in the participation services in ways that won't get struck down legally? As a professional lawyer, I know you know the law as well, that won't get struck down legally for being discriminatory if we write in language particular to Black folks, or write in language particular to communities that have been harmed. How can we write in that language to make sure that we can participate without having to worry about being struck down in court?
So first, let me say, one of the things that the legislature traditionally does when it comes to opportunities for Black people, and this is all the way back with the HBCU legislation, the funding for HBCUs, and multiple other things, is they talk about, oh, well, this could be struck down by the court. My position is, let's put forth legislation, and if it's struck down by the court, then that's, a chance that we'll take. But that being said, the idea is not to have specific race-based language in it, but language that is more broadly going to impact the people that we want, the populations that we want, but not specifically be race-based language. So we're talking about in requests for proposals for licensing, that we would favor those potential companies or individuals that have a plan and a proposal that's going to incorporate workforce and opportunities for minority businesses in specific areas, specific zip codes, similar to probably what you heard with the fund for the tax revenues going specifically into communities that have been negatively impacted by marijuana prohibition. I think that's one of the ways, making sure that nobody basically, if you don't have a proposal that's going to include us, then you don't get a license.
I laugh when you say favor, because I can imagine some of our adversaries say, well, that's not fair. But much like you said about cannabis earlier, we've already been favoring certain people, and we're telling ourselves a lie if we don't continue, if we think that we're doing it differently in some other way. Let's move a little bit toward your legislative priorities for the upcoming General Assembly. We know that this is an important issue, and this will have important ramifications on our community, but there are a number of issues that you are concentrating on. Tell the folks in attendance and those watching via stream what you will be concentrating on that we should be supporting you as you work through the Legislative Assembly.
So may I first say that there is an issue that has been burning in my gut for some time, and it's maybe not yet talked about as a priority of any particular group, but I would ask the people put on the radar. Ever since the first day I was in the General Assembly, almost 20 years ago, and even before that, there was an effort afoot to eliminate any and all judicial elections, meaning that the only judges that would ever sit on any court would be appointed by the governor, whoever the governor is. And for many years, we were able to stave that off, but now there is a specific movement afoot, and I believe the votes to pass it. And, with the exception of me and maybe one or two others, for the most part, a lot of the members, even of the Legislative Black Caucus, have bought into this false narrative that, well, when we have appointments, those appointments are often discriminatory. Elections are discriminatory. that we need to have the appointments to ensure that there's diversity on the bench. The first thing I want to say is that in district court, which is probably where we need the elections the most, we have only appointments, and that there's less diversity on the district court than the circuit court. But the second thing is, here's the real issue. There should not be an elitist group that chooses people that they know or favor because they've been deemed safe, they've been deemed pro-police, pro-prosecution on criminal justice issue, they've been deemed pro-corporation on civil issues. Those are the people that are often selected because those are the ones that are favored by the members of Piper and Marbury and Venable Beecher and Howard that often sit on these, make up the majority of these nominating commissions. And those are also the people that have the close access to the governor. And I don't care if the governor is Democrat or if the governor is Republican. Those are always the people. Those people don't change. They're always the ones that have the access. And I just believe that, and any of you know some sole practitioners or individual lawyers that are great and hustle, but they're never going to have time to go and join and sit at all these Maryland State bar meetings or Baltimore City bench meetings. They're too busy working for the people. They're too busy doing that. And we should never foreclose the opportunity for someone to be able to run for election for judge and take their case to the people. And so if we do that, if we allow this to happen, we will have no opportunity whatsoever for the people to decide who should preside over the most significant issues of their lives, which is what is in circuit court. District court is light, it's misdemeanors mostly, but circuit court is the serious stuff that affects us, and they want to take away the right of the people to elect their judges. And really quickly, I won't be too much longer on this, and the false arguments are, well, lawyers contribute to judges' campaigns and then judges won't be able to be fair. Well, guess what? Advocacy groups, people, lobbyists, corporations, all manner of folks contribute to our campaigns, and does that affect us, our ability to be fair? Probably, but we're not saying that we're not going to have, legislative elections. And so the bottom line is that that's a false argument. If you want to do something about that, then reform campaign finance, but don't ruin our chance to elect our judges. So that's a big issue. The other issue that I think is really the issue of the session, of course, is the marijuana issue. What are we going to do? Are we going to be serious? Are we going to be driven by a moral code, a code of values that says in this very new industry, we are going to ensure that people that have been harmed, that have been neglected, that have been criminalized, are now specifically targeted to have opportunities to not only overcome the taint of criminality, but to avail themselves of economic opportunities and benefits. Without that, there is no purpose for legalization. And so I think that the details of that are going to be important, but I also feel that it's going to be a very, very difficult challenge and uphill battle, because I'm pretty sure that, as usually happens, there will be some half-baked ideas or superficial proposals that on the face may appear to be good, but they won't be good enough, and many people will want to support them. And if you need any example of how that could happen, just look at what happened with medical marijuana and how it did not result in any benefit for anybody outside of a small, select, already rich group of people. We cannot allow that to happen, and I would urge all of you, no matter how passionate you are about legalizing marijuana, speak out against anything that falls short of actually what we need to have to help change and reform and repair the society, the damage to society.
Senator, you said something, I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here, particularly when you talked about the elimination of judicial elections. What committees are most likely to be the ones to carry the water there? So those of us in attendance, because many of us are familiar with the General Assembly and understand that the committees are really where a lot of legislation either sinks or swims. What committees should we be paying attention to, either in your chamber, in the Senate side, or in the House of Delegates, that would threaten judicial elections?
So that's going to be my committee, the Judicial Proceedings Committee, and it's gonna be in the House, it's gonna be the Judiciary Committee. Oftentimes, if they think a bill that is a priority of leadership will struggle in a committee, they find a workaround to put it in a committee that is more easy to pass through. But I can't imagine any scenario how they could take judicial elections away from judiciary or judicial proceedings. So it'll be our committee.
We appreciate that. With your priorities, and as folks have been plotting along the last 8 years, we've gone against Governor Hogan. Now, to the rest of the United States, political observers, they seem to think he's some sort of a moderate, some sort of a person you can work with, right? But we know that he called our school teachers union thugs. We know that he's disinvested in Baltimore time and again. We know that he continues to refund the police. But now we have a different person that will be in the executive mansion. How will that change how you will do your work going into this General Assembly?
So it's gonna change it quite a bit. I think the dynamic is different, but I think that the first thing that you brought up, Ray, is important for people to really focus on, which is the fact that we've had a governor who, for every major issue that the Democrats pushed and that many of us support, is a governor that vetoed every single one of those major issues, and that we had the numbers to override the governor's vetoes. The difference now is that we won't have to have those numbers to pass legislation, because we won't have to ostensibly be looking to override a veto. And so it should be easier to pass major legislation, because we don't need a two-thirds majority anymore. Even though we have it, we don't need it. The question is going to be, will the Democrat leadership stand up for the ideals that the Democratic Party purports to stand up for, and will it stand for the people without a Republican to juxtapose itself against? And I don't know. It remains to be seen. We haven't seen, in the past we didn't see it. And let me briefly say, under the years of the last Democratic governor, Amanuel, we didn't get blueprint for Maryland's future, which is the reform for our school system. We didn't get HBCU funding legislation. We didn't get police accountability. We didn't get the Environmental Solutions Act. So many of these common sense things we didn't get when we had a Democrat governor. It took having a Republican in there that was against it, verbally against it, so that the Democrats said, oh, we're going to show the Republican up, and we're going to show the people that we are the better party than this awful Republican governor.
I'm glad you alluded to that, because I'm curious, with the Republican, there's an incentive to get that overwhelming majority of so much legislation that ostensibly would be good for the people. Are you worried at all that if a Democratic governor, particularly a Black Democratic governor, particularly a Black Democratic governor who claims Baltimore as his political foundation, if he vetoes something that we know it's good for us, that you are worried that other Democrats will fall in line, well, I don't want to go against our governor, or I don't want to go against what he would say. Should we be concerned at that potentiality?
We should be concerned about everything. But we should be concerned about that. But I think that it's less likely that Governor Moore, sorry about this, would be put in a position to veto something that appears to be good for the people of Maryland. I think that most likely we'll find that there's stalling and stagnation, and that those kinds of things don't pass. But you're gonna have to ask yourself, why on earth wouldn't it pass? When you have all of the numbers, you have more Democrats now after this election in the House and the Senate. There is just no reason why it shouldn't pass. I think that what you gotta do, and I gotta go back to my girl, Nina Turner, who I discovered, some years back when she was a spokesperson for Bernie Sanders, but I loved her line. When she said, any old blue just won't do. And I say that just because we're Black doesn't mean we have your back. And that's important because, it's not personal, but you've got to not be satisfied because you have a Democrat supermajority or because you have a Black person in position. You've got to hold them accountable for the things that we want them there for. And, all the way back in the 60s, when we started to get more Black people in office, in Baltimore and Maryland, across the country, many of those people, not all, but many, were rooted. They came out of the civil rights struggle. So they really did have an agenda for justice and equity and those things that we cherish. But this is a different day. And so just because you see someone that is a Democrat, labels themselves even progressive, or is Black, do not be fooled or do not be, triggered into believing that you can't challenge them if they are not doing what you believe they need to do to serve our constituency.
We're going to let you get out of here on this one. We appreciate the time that you've given us so far. What is it that you as a legislator want us, the community, to do to support you? We don't want you to feel like you're in Annapolis fighting this fight by yourself. We don't want you charging to the top of the hill, turning around and not seeing the cavalry. Right. So what is it that you would task us to do to help support you, to help ensure that you have the backing that you need when you make these difficult complaints, when you file this agitation, when they call you a rabble rouser, when they say that you're a troublemaker and you're just getting away? How is it that we can show up for you to affirm that you are indeed the people's citizen?
Thank you. Well, that's loaded. I'm assuming people have jobs and you can't just live in Annapolis the whole session and, sleep in the committee rooms and the chambers. But absent that, one, of course, know who your specific legislators are. And on all of these critically important issues, reach out to those legislators that represent you, that you voted for, or that rely on your vote, and bring others with you to challenge them, to ask them where they stand on the issues. And if they don't stand where they should stand, then challenge them. And, I actually have said this before, I like it when people send me emails or call and say, I'm gonna need you to do this, and if you don't do it, I'm not voting for you. Okay, that's kind of effective, because then it gets your attention. It gets your attention. The other thing I think is important is the media. We've seen in the past the media having a love fest with power, right? It doesn't really matter whether it was the Democrat leadership or even Governor Hogan. They had a love fest because I think there's a fear that if I don't support this person in power or this power structure, that I will no longer be given the feed, no longer be given the scoop. I'll be outcast. I won't be the first to crack the story. So you got to hold the media accountable and don't just rely on the media to tell the story. I'm a big fan of writing your own story, writing your own letters to the editor, writing your own op-eds, utilizing the talk media circuit, utilizing the TV news. And to be honest with you, you'd be surprised, many of these news outlets, they love a person to come on to kind of be provocative and make a story more sexy. They love the voice of opposition to power. And so just be more proactive about that. And if you're part of an organization, don't just be on your own, have a whole organization, do some of these things, write a letter. It's very effective to say that, this group, the NAACP, has written this op-ed in favor of judicial elections, so to speak, something like that.
We want to give Senator Carter a round of applause. We're going to transition to our panel.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to ask our panelists to come up who are on our next panel. And while we are in transition, I want to invite you to grab a snack, grab some water. If you have not used the bathroom yet, you can actually go out to this door to the right for the men's bathroom, and women's bathroom is out this door up the stairs. So while we're in transition, I just want to remind folks that today's event is sponsored by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and that you should give us money right now. I appreciate you very much. Also, I want to encourage you, if you have not become a sustainer, because, lots of people, Giving Tuesday was like last week or something like that. And people typically donate once to an organization, which is great. For LBS, we are a political organization, meaning that our work is not tax deductible, but you are investing in a Black political organization working on behalf of the Black community. So I want to encourage you to do that before you leave today. So up here we have a similar panel of some. All right. So, sure. Yeah, we're going to take about a couple minute break. So I want to take a quick to the bathroom, come back and start our next panel. Appreciate you very much. Grab some food.
Attention.
Last channel, turn it down to the last channel. Turn it down to
Brother Slade, you want to come up to the camera?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, and we are gonna get started with our panel this afternoon. We hope you can take a seat really fast so we can get started. Really appreciate if everybody took a seat so we can get started this afternoon. All right. And so we're gonna bring ourselves to our final panel this afternoon. This will be the panel that's gonna be fairly long. It's gonna take us the rest of the afternoon. And we're also gonna have lots of opportunity for you to ask questions. Ray will explain how we're doing that this afternoon. I know each panelist will introduce themselves, but I want to make sure that everyone knows the names of the folks who are up here. So we have, of course, Mr. Ray Baker, professor at Towson University, who is our moderator for this afternoon. Big shout out to Reverend Kevin Slayton, the pastor of this church, Northwood Apple Methodist Church. Want a big round of applause for the church this afternoon. Ms. Zakiya Sankara-Jabar, she is the co-executive director of Racial Justice Now. Clap it up for her. Ms. Yanet Amanuel, she is the director of public policy for the ACLU of Maryland. Clap it up for Ms. Yanet. Ms. Cathryn Paul, she is the director of public policy for CASA. Clap it up for CASA. Cathryn for CASA. Crystal. Ms. Crystal Williams, she's the director of government relations for the Office of the Public Defender. Clap it up for her. And lastly, we have Mr. Dayvon Love, who is the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle. Clap it up for Dayvon. All right, so in case you miss anything this afternoon, you're like, oh man, that quote, that thing they said, everything's being live streamed to the LBS YouTube page. You can find it at LBS Baltimore on the YouTube page. It will also be posted on our website, www.lbsbaltimore.com. And if you want to email us, info@lbsbaltimore.com. In case you miss anything this afternoon, you didn't catch something, feel free to contact us and we'll make sure to follow up with you. I'll pass it right now to Mr. Ray Baker, who will explain how today's conversation will go.
Thank you, Adam. Let's give it up for Adam one time, the CEO of LBS. Yeah. On the mic, and for those who might be watching via stream, as soon as he gets off the mic, he's going to make sure the stream is right, making sure you guys get a good product. How the conversation is going to go is generally the questions will be targeted to one of our panelists, and then panelists, you all feel free to jump in, piggyback on one another, and I'll be sure to get in wherever I can fit in whenever we need to ask another question. Of course, Reverend Slayton, this is your house, so whenever you want to talk, you just stop all of what we're doing. You shut it down, and you get the floor. That's how we're going to give deference to how it should go. I believe there are some note cards that some of the staff and some of the team of LBS may have. If so, those folks during the course of our conversation will be passing note cards around to folks. Feel free to write your question down on a note card. One of the things we'll do is that every so often, since we'll be here for a period of time, some folks will bring some note cards up to me to ensure that we can maybe integrate your questions into the conversation in the event that your question may not have already been asked. We are going to offer some time to have question and answer, but we know sometimes that becomes a time when we have comment and listen as opposed to question and answer. And so we hope that we can get some questions. And Brother Adam right now is dropping a couple of note cards at each table. Please feel free to jot down your question. Hold your note card up. They'll know that there's a question on the floor. We'll get it that way. That way we can try to integrate the conversation. I've been using that word so much, they're gonna kick me out. They ain't gonna let me come to LBS stuff no more. We're gonna try to integrate the question into the conversation in a more traditional and fluid way. So in the event that we don't get the kind of dialogue and Q&A that we want toward the end, folks can still feel as though their question has been asked and answered. I'm gonna get it started with our panel while we're doing this. Dayvon, I'm gonna start with you. Lay out for us what were some of the major victories and challenges during the legislative session for LBS in 2022.
All right, y'all hear me? It's on. All right. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to both be here with you all. As it relates to this question, so as it's been clear, one of the big things that LBS worked on was cannabis legalization and all the other issues around that. Partnered very closely with the ACLU of Maryland. And so I'll actually leave some of what we worked on to Yanet to talk about. I'm gonna focus on two things in terms of the things that we were able to accomplish and then some of the challenges. So Lawrence mentioned earlier the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund that passed during the Maryland General Assembly last session. And we actually think that was actually extremely significant. It's extremely significant because the way 30% of the tax revenues are going to come to this fund, and each jurisdiction, the law dictates that each jurisdiction has to pass a law that determines how those resources are spent. And that's important because it allows the local legislature, your local councils, city and county councils, to put pressure on them to be able to have an impact as to how those resources are allocated. So that's going to be the case in every jurisdiction. And Baltimore, we're actually working currently with the city council president's office and a few council people to work on Baltimore's version of that, which will be explicitly about reparations and using that frame. So that was one of the biggest victories that we're able to get on cannabis. And again, shout out to Senator Carter, for whom the bill that provision originated in was Senator Carter's bill, Cannabis Legalization and Reparations for the War on Drugs Act. So that provision originated in Senator Carter's bill. And I have to give some credit to Senator Hayes, Antonio Hayes, who sits on the committee and put a lot of energy into making sure that that provision was passed with all the other things that passed through the Maryland General Assembly. The thing that was the challenge and will continue to be a challenge is, as Senator Carter mentioned, the licensing. It's very complex, and I'll say a few kind of big picture things about that. The first is that it's actually quite astonishing. When you think about like the emerging progressive movement, it's actually kind of astonishing that cannabis legalization is not first and foremost as an agenda item for the progressive movement. I argue the reason why it's not is because unlike some of the other issues that are important, Medicare for all, general criminal justice reform, the piece around cannabis legalization is also an opportunity to invest huge amounts of capital to Black people, to create the kind of wealth acquisition. And it's an opportunity, and it really is an industry that should be earmarked for our community specifically. And so I think, it speaks to some of the limitations of the progressive movement. So the challenge, though, is going to be how to operationalize a licensing scheme that creates the opportunity for Black people to benefit as much as possible from the wealth that's going to come as a result of this industry. And a part of the challenge is that it's going to be very difficult to think about legislative interventions that can counter the huge disparity in wealth. Because the thing about cannabis being in the business is that it's so capital intensive, right? So if you want to be at the highest levels of the industry, dispensaries, or be a grower, you're talking multi-million dollars worth of capital that it requires to even play in that space. And so it's going to be very difficult at the highest levels to ensure that Black folks are able to get access to that level of capital acquisition. But I will say that it's going to be important that in spite of that, there are other aspects of the industry that are also important that are less capital intensive. So things like transportation or security, social consumption sites. These are aspects of the industry that are less capital intensive, where the bar of entry is much lower, and that presents opportunities for Black people to get access to business opportunities as a result of this industry, that we should try to make sure that there will be legislative mechanisms by which we can monopolize those parts of the industry. So that was the challenge, and that's why they ultimately didn't pass anything as it related to the regulations of it, because it's so complex. And there's such at least a rhetorical commitment to ensure that Black people benefit from the industry. This coming session, the challenge will be to what extent that gets accomplished.
Yeah, go ahead and build on that.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. So as you mentioned, we introduced the bill with Senator Carter that was a more comprehensive bill that included the Cannabis Reinvestment Fund, which we're very proud of, that passed and we made it into the final bill. But also on criminal justice, we were looking at it from the perspective that if we're going to be legalizing marijuana, then it makes no sense to continue to criminalize it. So in that bill, we included language to eliminate penalties for possession, including possession with intent to distribute, because we shouldn't be punishing people who don't have the capital to join the industry for just trying to make a living. And then also prohibiting odor searches, because police shouldn't be able to use something that's going to be a legal odor now to criminalize and racially profile people. And none of this bill didn't move, and it was assigned to Finance Committee. But what, a good outcome that did come out of that is because we were very intent on, sticking to the bill and making sure that we actually address these issues, it did force the legislature to introduce a companion bill that did include some of this stuff, which there's still a lot more to do. So what came out of that is that now the time limit to be able to expunge possession with intent to distribute has been reduced now to 3 years. So it was previously 15 years, and before that wasn't even expungible. So now it'll be 3 years after somebody completes probation or parole or community supervision. Additionally, they reduced the penalty for possession to just 6 months. But we said, we're still going to go back and say that, completely eliminate those criminal charges. So there's still a lot more work to do, but, through that advocacy, we were able to at least get some of the stuff this year, and definitely going to be coming back for that. Another victory from last session was passing the Child Interrogation Protection Act. It was also sponsored by Senator Carter. And what this bill does is that it requires an attorney to consult, requires that an attorney be consulted when a child is taken into custody and that parents are notified when their child is in custody. Sounds like common sense, but it took 3 years to pass, and it finally got passed last year. And of course, it was vetoed, and we were able to overturn it. Another challenge was a bill we introduced last session that would have conformed the Baltimore Civilian Review Board and the Police Accountability Board, which each county in Maryland was required to establish. And what this bill would have done would have taken the current CRB and just expanded it to include the new powers of the Police Accountability Board. And that would have included still independent investigatory powers, independent counsel, and adequate funding to carry out their duties. And unfortunately, that bill did not pass. And what we have now is a PAB that's still not set up and a CRB that is still limited in their authority. And it's duplicative and a waste of resources. And so we're still waiting to get, see how that is going to get set up. But that was an opportunity, could have been an opportunity to seamlessly transition and create a stronger oversight body. And so we're still waiting to see how that's going to work out. But still a lot more work to do on police reform, which I'll get to a little bit later.
Yanet, real quick, PAB, CRB, for folks who may be watching and may not know, what are those?
Police Accountability Board. So when we passed the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021, one of the things it did is require that every county, including Baltimore City, establish a police accountability board. And the whole point of this police accountability board is to function as an oversight board, an external oversight board, and be able to monitor how police misconduct complaints are being handled, and basically be accountable to the community. And then the CRB is the Baltimore Civilian Review Board, which was established in 1999, I'm sorry. Which is, and then, so those are the two definitions, and I'm sorry about that.
No, thank you. We appreciate that a great deal. Reverend Slayton, I want to come to you for a second because I'm curious about how those in the church would frame what a legislative victory would be versus, and I don't want to put the church on the outside of activism, right? We know that the Black church has a long tradition of activism, but we also know that some things have changed in some times as we've moved on. So how would you, from where you stand and the work that you do in the community, what would you frame as your major victories in the last legislative session, and what were some of your challenges?
Well, actually, can you hear me? I am actually representing my day job. I don't just preach. My day job is with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. We deal specifically with the impacts of fiscal and tax policy. Any rap fans here familiar with this brother by the name of T.I.? He says this: if it ain't about the money, it ain't about what? Nothing. To your question, I did a paper in 2005 as a lobbyist. Senator Carter will be familiar with this. The end of each legislative session, they do what's called a winner and losers report in the Baltimore Sun. You familiar with that? It says who won and who lost during the 90-day session. I'm going to get to your question about the church. 2005, the paper I was looking at, it said that the Black church won. I was head of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance at the time, which is the leading African-American Black clergy group. I was like, what in the hell, excuse me, I'm in church. What did we do that was so impactful that we were listed as a winner? So I went to my buddies over at the Baltimore Jewish Council. They do their own internal piece. And their report said they had almost a $1.8 billion impact that they could measure on the legislative session. They were not listed in the Baltimore Sun as winner. Went to my friends over at the Catholic Charities. They do their own in-house report. Their report said they had almost a $2 billion, I think the budget that year was about $36 billion, but they could attest to about a $2 billion impact. But the black church was listed as a winner. What did we do? Anybody want to take a guess? We changed the name on the airport to Thurgood Marshall, and guess what? As of yesterday, people still call it BWI because we didn't have any fiscal attachment to it. The black church, as well as all of us in this room, while we are concerned about the issues that are driving the 90-day session, T.I. is right. It ain't about the money. It ain't about nothing. So the black church didn't do much this year, but hopefully we'll be better this year.
I like that. All right. That was very T.I., huh? All right. And those of you all who might be looking for a church who might also like T.I., make note. Crystal, I'm going to come to you. The Office of the Public Defender is often an office that does some of the most important work, but is frequently unheralded. How did you all look at the last 2022? How did you all look at that as a legislative session? What were the victories that you're proud of? I imagine the child interrogation law that we heard earlier was something that you all be supportive of, but please expound upon that or tell us about things that we may not have already heard of.
Yes, absolutely. And, with the Public Defender's Office, I don't think a lot of people realize how involved we are with advocacy and legislation. We are an agency across the entire state of Maryland. We have over 1,000 employees, over 600 attorneys and other support staff and experts. And so we are on the ground every day with the issues that impact the community. And so we also have that expertise to make an impact on the legislature. And so it's important that folks know that they can come to us with their issues, with their concerns, with their ideas or proposals, and that we will help champion those in Annapolis. And so in terms of the victories, everything that's already been stated, and, we have been actively a part of that and making sure that we're helping push that across the line as well. But in addition to that, we've also had a huge change, which has changed the landscape of juvenile justice reform. And obviously Senator Carter, who's sponsor of that as well, in terms of making sure that Maryland is held accountable in terms of how we treat our kids within the criminal justice system and keeping them out of the criminal justice system. Maryland is ranked as one of the worst states in the country in terms of protecting kids' rights. And so I think there's a big misperception about what the Public Defender's Office does. There is I think a falsehood that we don't care about public safety, that our job is just to get people out, to get people back on the street. That is not true. Our job is to protect the rights of all individuals that we represent. And what the community needs to know is that they have to hold the entire system accountable. And so if the state's attorney is not doing their job, if the judge is not doing their job, and a person gets off on a particular charge, that's because we're protecting their constitutional rights, and that the other side is not doing their job. And so we have to rethink how we're thinking about the criminal justice system and the rights that all of you are afforded if you ever encounter the criminal justice system. And so when we look at children, it is so important that is a generation that we have to rethink what we're doing and how we're doing it. In Maryland, before this bill was passed, there was no age restriction on how young a child could be prosecuted. As young as 5 and 7 years old, children were being processed through the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system. That is just simply horrendous. And so one of the things that the bill did is it actually put the floor on the age of children that can be brought into the juvenile justice system. The other thing that they did, the age restriction is 11 based on certain crimes, 13 based on additional crimes. One of the other aspects of the juvenile justice reform bill that it did is it made sure that it addressed probation. Before, a child could be placed on indefinite probation. In a child's mind, that's literally forever. While the juvenile jurisdiction goes until the age of 21, a child could be placed on probation for 2 years, 3 years. It could be extended until the child is 21. And so we have to rethink how we're actually holding children accountable and what it means to them and whether it's actually effective. And so we know that it was not effective to not give any definitive terms to children to be looking for a goal to reach and to, provide them services to actually make sure that they're getting the help that they need. The other aspect of the bill is that it made sure that there are diversion opportunities available. So, some of the low-level offenses can actually have that opportunity to be diverted away from the court system. We have to stop relying on the criminal justice system to fix all the problems that are going on in our communities and that are going on with our children. And so the other thing that the bill did is making sure that it not allow for kids to be incarcerated, detained, and placed on low-level offenses or infraction offenses. One of the things that we did not accomplish that is going to be, that already is our #1 priority for the next session, and that was one of the remaining recommendations of the Juvenile Justice Reform Council, in addition to what I just mentioned, is ending the automatic charging of kids as adults. Right. That is something that Maryland also is an outlier in terms of how we prosecute children. And so I don't think a lot of people understand that Maryland has a history of actually dividing that treatment of children who are charged as adults by race. And so in Baltimore City in particular, the age of majority of our children could be charged as adults was 16 for decades beyond the other jurisdictions throughout the state. What does that mean? Children across the state, mostly white communities, could be afforded the benefit of being treated as a child at the age of 16 and get juvenile services. Whereas in Baltimore City, that child was automatically treated as an adult. And so it did not change until, that was, I believe, in the 40s and 50s, it did not change until the 60s or 70s to actually raise the age of majority for children in Baltimore City to the age of 18 and to be, concurrent with the rest of the state. And so we have to look at why were these policies in place and how is that impacting how things are being done today? How is that impacting our perception of who is deemed violent, who is deemed a predator, who is deemed to be not worthy of investment in that rehabilitative aspect of our criminal justice system. So we really have to rethink what we're doing as a community, and that includes everybody not looking to the criminal justice system to answer our problems for these issues. And I know a lot of you heard about the recent case that came out in Wisconsin, the 10-year-old child who was who just killed his mother and is now being prosecuted as an adult. Wisconsin is also an outlier state. What a lot of people are not looking to in that particular case, and I don't think folks really understand the Child Interrogation Protection Act. I've questioned what rights were in place when that child was being interrogated, because there's a lot of information in the news right now about what that child said. Where was his attorney and who was protecting him while he was being interrogated by the police? What is also not being discussed is that child had severe mental health issues. We are not talking about what is going on with our children. This child's family was ostracized for the things that was going on with this child and the issues that he was having. He was hearing voices. That is a serious issue that we are not talking about. And so people, when they only focus on the crime and when they only focus on the offense, they disregard all of the reasons that maybe led to that. And so as a Black community, we also have to really embrace mental health and supporting each other, supporting our communities in terms of how we address mental health and how we actually get better at creating a healthy environment, physically, mentally, emotionally, and socially, so that children do not get criminalized and that so our communities don't get criminalized for issues that are actually rooted in mental health issues. So that is going to be a huge aspect for us moving forward in terms of eliminating that. So that is definitely a big challenge. We have a wide array of other issues that I'll pass along to other folks, but yes.
Zakiya, I'm going to come to you, but before I do, I want to set some context for our audience, those watching and those in person. Something that Senator Carter said very early, cannabis had always been legal, right? And she denoted that in certain communities it was, in certain communities it's not. And the thing I appreciate is that when you talk about the diversion, the options for diversion, there may be, when we take some of this back to our communities, to our loved ones, do we try to organize, and even in our own families, they may say, I don't know, those folks deserve what they get. Diversions have always been an option, just not always for us. And so I appreciate you introducing that, and I hope that we take with us that language and that understanding. Zakiya, I want to talk to you. What were some of the major victories that you felt proud of your organization accomplishing during 2022? Things that we want to celebrate you for, but also, what were some of those challenges?
Thanks, brother. Can you all hear me? Cool. So I'm Zakiya. I am based actually in Montgomery County. I'm co-executive director for Racial Justice Now, and our work is primarily focused on racial justice, obviously, but particularly education justice and how that impacts Black children and Black families. I don't like the language, when wins and losses and things like that. Especially I have an issue with win when it comes to our community, because lots of times it's like stuff that we're having to fight for should be common sense. And as everybody has noted, Senator Carter said, a lot of these things already happen in other communities. It's just that we're having to fight to always center our humanity. Like, we are constantly fighting for this system to even recognize our humanity. And so this session for us, particularly, which was around policing in schools, a lot of people don't realize when we're talking about the juvenile justice piece, a huge pipeline is actually the schools into our young people getting caught up in the legal system. And so that whole piece for us is all about prevention. That whole piece for us is all about prevention. And there were 2 delegates out of Montgomery County in the previous session who introduced bills around policing in schools. One was simply a statewide ban on taking police out of school. And then the other one was around shifting the $10 million slush fund that the governor and the state set aside for school districts across the country to literally pour money into investing police into our schools. And so I just want to address really quickly, because I know that this, is a sensitive issue even within our community. There isn't uniformity around this issue. The piece is schools are relying on police for basic things. I mean, literally, that the school should be taken care of. School discipline issues are now being criminalized and disproportionately impacting Black children. In Montgomery County, Black students only make up 20% of the school district, but was over 45% of all of the arrests that was happening within the school district. And so for us, that's clearly a problem. We have teachers who are weaponizing the police against our kids for things like disrespect or rolling their eyes. I mean, like petty stuff, like it should be addressed, by the school code of conduct. And then we also have principals who are weaponizing the police, against our children. And listen, we know that there's a lot, that's happening in society, and certainly our children are being impacted by that. So one of the things that we fight for, or several things that we fight for as an alternative to police, is making sure that we're, number one, investing heavily into education, period. Meaning that when it comes to discipline, that we are using strategies when implemented with fidelity actually work, like restorative justice and restorative practices. Making sure that our children have access to culturally competent mental health support. A lot of things that we saw, at least in Montgomery County, with the police and its involvement with young people, was also the issue of disability and the things that young people, are dealing with, on that piece. So one of the things we were able to do, at least locally, was to push for wellness centers in all of our schools that are staffed with social workers, staffed with, lay folks, who are just people from the community, from particular neighborhoods, who know the community and who, can help disrupt violence before it even happens. All of these things, have been proven to be very successful when implemented in other parts of the country. So I just wanted to say it's not just about like removing the police and not making sure that there is a ecosystem of wholeness within our schools that literally just starts with relationships and making sure that the young people themselves have an adult that they feel safe around, have an adult that they can go to when they're not, feeling themselves, or go to and say, hey, I'm thinking about starting a fight or something. We need to stop relying so heavily on the police, especially when it comes to Black children.
That's a great point. We're gonna, Panelists, you guys keep the mic. I'll just project a little bit. A quick note, real quick. No, you guys keep the mic. Anybody get a chance to see the City versus Poly versus City football game and what happened afterwards? Anybody see that in the news? All right. So for those who may not be familiar, City and Poly are rivals here in Baltimore, and there was a fight that broke out. The fight actually started among coaches. What I would like to draw everyone's attention to was the fight started, the fight ended. City School Police, North Baltimore City Police made it to the field. We solved our problem. Those players went over there and broke their coaches up. Their fellow coaches went out there and said, not in front of our players. And yes, there was a disagreement. Yes, there was physical conflict. And then it stopped. And then it was resolved. And everyone went home safely. And I appreciate that you talk about ways to intervene without offering or bringing in the police. I see you have, Brother Quinn, I have cards that are going around. Please fill out the cards. I've gotten the first round of them. But before we go to those questions from the cards, we do want to make sure we give Cathryn an opportunity to let us know, Cathryn, what it was that you were proud of, that you accomplished, that CASA accomplished, that we should celebrate you for, and what were some of the challenges from the last legislative session?
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Dayvon. Thank you, LBS. So for people who are not familiar with CASA, CASA is the largest immigrant rights organization in the Mid-Atlantic region and obviously here in Maryland. And I'm so happy to be here because I think people don't think about immigration as a Black issue, and it is. And so across the board, especially in the national media, when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about Mexico. We're talking about what's happening at the border and Black immigrants and the stories of Black immigrants and the hardships of Black immigrants and the challenges that we face are completely left out of that conversation. And so I'm so happy to be here. CASA represents, we're a membership-based organization. We have a very large membership ranging from all throughout Latin America, Central America, and we have a growing membership throughout the Caribbean and Africa. And so as our membership grows, it's really important that we as an organization, but not just as an organization, we broadly in the immigration advocacy world continue to center and prioritize Black immigrants. So really excited to talk about this. So I think CASA supported pretty much everything we talked about here. So I want to talk specifically about some of the immigration specific things. One victory, and by victory I mean small step towards an end goal, is passing the Healthy Babies Equity Act. And that was a bill that opened up Medicaid to undocumented pregnant women. So if you're undocumented, you do not have access to Medicaid, you're ineligible. You're ineligible to get healthcare through the Affordable Care Act. You're ineligible for, a variety of different public services. And so we have this vision at CASA to make sure that the entire undocumented community has access to healthcare. The advocacy started because we at CASA saw tons of people who were coming to us who were seeing a doctor on the day of their delivery for the first time. And this is so important, right? Because we're seeing tons of different things, miscarriages happen, a million different medical things that can go wrong, right, without healthcare. Obviously, this is specific to pregnant women, right, or pregnant people. And this is just the first step. I think what's coming next is making sure that our children, our documented children and adults, and really it's people 65 and older who have, who need the healthcare the most. There's probably, it's very hard to get data just broadly on the state level, but about 9% broadly of the undocumented community are Black immigrants, right? That includes Afro-Latinas, folks from all throughout the Caribbean, folks, obviously African immigrants. And so it's so important that when we're thinking about and looking at the immigration related bills that are moving forward, we're remembering that this is impacting our folks. So that was a great victory and small step in the right direction. So thank you to everyone who supported that. And I think we'll continue on this journey towards making sure everyone has access to healthcare. The other thing that I wanted to talk about that was victory was securing funds for access to counsel in immigration proceedings. So usually if you commit a crime, you will get a public defender when you go to court and you don't have money for it, right? When you go to immigration court, you do not have a right to a lawyer. So there are tons of people who don't speak the language, who have no idea, because our immigration system is so complex, how to navigate that, and are forced to represent themselves in immigration court before a judge. And of course, they lose their cases, right? I think it's something like 80-something% of people who have representation are more likely to win their cases alone. So we worked on the bill.
One more time, please. That's an important take home. Can you give folks that stat one more time, please?
Yeah, of course. It's 80%. You're 80% more likely to win your immigration case if you have access to a lawyer in immigration court. And so we've done a lot of work to end ICE detention in Maryland. We passed a bill, Dignity Not Detention Bill, which ends private ICE detention in Maryland. So now there are no ICE facilities or places where folks can be detained on behalf of ICE in Maryland. But still, there are Marylanders, disproportionately Black immigrants, by the way. As we know, Black immigrants, right, are sort of facing double jeopardy, right? Because they're being targeted by police and they're being targeted by immigration enforcement. So they get pulled over for broken taillight. It doesn't just result in an unfair charge, right? It also results in, after doing their time, being reported directly to ICE, and then, you know, depending on what's happening in their country, depending on a variety of different factors, possibly facing, you know, life-changing or, you know, risking their life when they're deported to their home country. So last session, we were able to secure, I think it was $3.6 million in the budget to provide that legal representation for detained immigrants facing immigration court. Now that's detained immigrants. If you have an asylum case, if you are just going through the normal court process, you still don't have a right to a lawyer, right? And there are organizations like CASA, like, you know, AYUDA, lots of organizations that are providing that support, but it doesn't even scratch the surface in terms of how much support is needed. So that money was a great start, and we're going to continue to advocate for increased funding and really mandate, right? I think the vision is to have something similar to right to counsel bill that comes back, so that we're not just basing, you know, people's lives off of how much money we have, but it's actually a requirement for people to have legal representation. So with that said, I'll pause there. Those are the two things I wanted to highlight, and we have a lot of work to do.
So we have a bunch of questions from the audience that are really good I want to get to, but I had a couple that I wanted to hone in on to really get the conversation started. So I'll phrase it this way, Yanet, I'll start with you. What are your legislative priorities for the upcoming session? Now, in that same question, what do you fear may be the most difficult to try to get accomplished, given all that we see on the horizon?
That's a great question. There's a couple things on our agenda, and our full legislative agenda will be released in a couple of weeks, but I want to highlight a couple bills. One, as I mentioned, a couple of years ago, we passed the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021. This bill repealed the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights and replaced it with a new police disciplinary process, and also required, like I mentioned, each county and Baltimore City to establish a police accountability board that's supposed to serve as this oversight board. In the implementation of this bill over the last year, we've been working primarily in Baltimore City, Prince George's County, Anne Arundel County, Montgomery County, and Baltimore County to establish these boards, and most importantly, make sure that they have the oversight powers that they need to actually be effective. That includes independent investigatory powers, because an oversight board is only as effective as the oversight powers that they have, and that includes independent investigatory powers. As long as police and internal affairs is conducting the investigations into police misconduct, the police are still going to be policing themselves. And we're not going to make any progress in actually holding police accountable or getting residents and community members to actually trust the integrity of these investigations. And so we were advocating for these issues on the local level, and I'll back up a little bit to mention that the reason why a lot of community members and the reason why a lot of people joined our coalition during the policing session is because they wanted to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, because it was an impediment to having stronger community oversight boards. And Baltimore City and Prince George's County are the only jurisdictions in the state that had these oversight boards that had these independent investigatory powers, but they weren't adequately funded, or they were limited in what they could investigate, and they had no power in actually turning out that information over into the decision makers, and didn't have a role in deciding discipline. And so our goal was to get closer to the oversight board, which is to have all these powers, including discipline powers. And the issue that we kept running into, well, one is the Fraternal Order of Police, who have been actively trying to undermine all of the police reform we passed in 2021. And they were opposing any efforts to empower these boards. And so one of the bills we'll be working on this session that will be sponsored by Senator Carter is to clarify that these local jurisdictions have the power to give these police accountability boards independent investigative powers. There's a lot of misinformation, a lot of confusion that was caused, and we just want to clarify they do in fact have this power, and we think that that's going to be critical to getting towards that progress of having these actual oversight boards that will be able to hold police accountable and be accountable to you all as community. The other thing that I mentioned, two bills that will be coming up this session is eliminating criminal penalties for possession with intent to distribute and eliminating criminal penalties for possession over the legal limit. This is really critical because as long as we still criminalizing marijuana, Black people will continue to face the brunt of the enforcement of these criminal penalties. And so again, it will continue to what we've been doing, which is only legalizing for white people. And again, can't overestimate how many, consistently across the state, even in states that have legalized or decriminalized, arrests might have decreased, but racial disparities in arrests have not. So it's really critical that we get this right, and we can look to how it did work in other states with and not addressing this. And the other thing is eliminating odor searches, like I mentioned. This is a tool that police use to justify racially profiling people. It's undercounted how many people actually searched and let go, but we know that at least from the people that are charged in these stops, over 90% are Black. And in across jurisdictions, for example, in Baltimore County, even though Black people only make up 30% of the population, they made up over 80% of those who are arrested. In Prince George's County, it's 90%. In Montgomery County, it's 58%. Consistently across the board, it's Black people who are being targeted. And another thing I'll add is that it just creates lazy policing. Police rely on the ability to stop someone because they smell marijuana as the basis for them to conduct the stop and investigation. And it doesn't really turn up anything, and is a waste of resources and time, and you're just harassing and criminalizing people, and it has real life consequences, and we have to address it this session. The last thing I'll mention is medical parole, removing the governor from medical parole. So a couple years ago, we passed a bill to remove the governor from the parole process. Maryland was one of 3 states that required that even after the parole commission said that someone could go home, the governor had the final say, and the governor wasn't letting anybody out. And it's important to know that Maryland still incarcerates the most Black people, most Black men in the country. 70% of our prison population is Black. And so this was just desperately impacting Black people. And so we made great strides. 70% of the prison population is Black.
Does that control for men and women? The entire 70% of the
yeah, Black. And there's a growing population of women who are being incarcerated. And so we removed the governor from the process except for medical parole, which was a technical error in the drafting process. This should be a simple bill to fix. It's just going back and saying that the governor is also removed from the medical parole process. And so hopefully it won't be a big lift, and we'll definitely be looking to you all. And the argument also is that these people who are eligible for medical parole are the most vulnerable population. These are people getting ready to die. And so they should be home with their families in their last, time here, and shouldn't have the governor in the process of that or blocking that. And so it's just a simple fix. And hope to have your support with that.
Reverend Slayton, the Center for Economic Policy, you guys are going to be working on some things that you told us already. If it ain't about the money, what about the money are y'all working on this section?
I am appreciative that my colleague Nansel Muna asked me to fill in for him. So he sent me the information. I'm not that well versed. The issues and priorities for this upcoming session are addressing the inequities once again in our tax system, and making sure that large profitable corporations and wealthy individuals are paying what they owe. So last year, there was a fair taxes package that was presented before the legislature. It's never popular. I only see one elected official still in the room. Taxes and raising taxes is never popular. So the key portion of the legislation dealt with an issue known as combined reporting. So if you've got a rib joint called Slayton's Ribs. I don't have a joint called Slayton's Ribs, but if I did, and it was set up in Maryland, when I filed my taxes, I paid Maryland taxes for Slayton's Ribs. But say Slayton's Ribs was international, and it was in LA, Chicago, Delaware. When I filed my taxes for Slayton's Ribs, to avoid paying Maryland taxes, I combined and reported, and I filed taxes in Delaware. So the legislation is really trying to address a great deal of resources that are escaping our state because large corporations get to, use these loopholes to pay taxes in other places. So once again, those issues will be coming back up. We will do work around EITC, working with our partners, which we have in the past. And again, for those of you who do advocacy work and you're not as well versed with fiscal and tax policy, MarylandMDEconomy.org, sign up, utilize the analysts we have on staff, and make sure that you're getting an appropriate look at the implications of the economics of the policies that are being driven. So that's primarily the work we'll be doing. And again, partnering with all of these organizations. We haven't announced an agenda yet. Again, a lot of it is dependent on the administration and where a lot of folks land. Again, because we deal with economic issues, and I don't think we've mentioned it. This is a very unique session we're going into. For decades, the governor who submits his budget, nobody could say much about it. They could, say what they didn't like, but it didn't really mean anything. And now the legislatures actually have much more say. We'll be able to influence and move things around and have a much greater impact on the policies and the budget that are impacting us. So we'll know more as we go into the beginning of the year and who lands where.
Cathryn, I want to come to you because I want to know what some of the goals are for CASA, some of the things that you all are working on that this upcoming session you hope to bring to fruition, and not just what you're working on, but who or what do you see is standing in your way?
Okay. Well, I already mentioned access to counsel, right? Making sure we have representation in immigration court. That is a fight that's going to continue, right? And we need to increase funding and also make it a mandate. So that's one priority. And I had written down to myself the longest recorded ICE detention in history was a group of Black immigrants, right? And so not only, I think there's an urgency around this, not just because it's impacting us, right? But also like what is happening is like a million times harsher, right? And so usually you go to court, you're innocent until proven guilty, right? In the immigration world, you're guilty until you're proven innocent, and you're detained until then. And so that is going to be a big priority. Other thing, like I mentioned, healthcare for the undocumented community, that is going to be a top priority. We took a step in the Medicaid direction last session. And the next thing we want to do is open up the ACA, make sure that anyone can buy into the Affordable Care Act, right? You still need to pay into it, right? So it's not quite Medicaid. We're going to work towards that. But for this session, we're going to start with the ACA and remove immigration status as a barrier. One big thing that we'll really need support with is we don't want to raise taxes, right? And we have to pay for this. We just have to. So one of the big asks that we have for folks to lean into is making sure that the subsidy program is matched. Because it means nothing if we remove immigration status as a barrier and then there's no money because it's not affordable and no one can actually buy into it. So that will be one other thing. And then just because, Reverend, you mentioned the EITC, CASA is also going to work on an EITC expansion bill. That's the Earned Income Tax Credit. During the pandemic, we expanded that for all taxpayers, regardless of your immigration status. And it sunsets this year, so we want to make sure that that becomes permanent. It's really important. The bill does a lot of other amazing things because lots of people who are eligible for the EITC, regardless of their status, are not applying for it. They don't know about it. And I'm talking about between $200 and $2,000 back when you file your taxes. That is huge, right? That's a lot of money. So flagging that for people. What's standing in our way? So many things. Listen, I personally am excited for Wes Moore to be our governor. And for those who don't know, I think it's 12% of Black people were born abroad. I think it's like another 9% are second generation immigrants, right? So that they at least have one immigrant born parent. And Wes Moore is one of those people. One of his mother was born in Jamaica, and I think like his grandmother came over from Cuba to Jamaica and then transitioned. So I'm excited that he has that experience and lived connection representing a group of people who is not often represented in government. Now, with that said, I think there's all this excitement about it, and it's going to keep us from staying focused on accountability, you know? And so while we're excited about this, I think it's very important that we stay consistent. I think it's important that in the same type of fashion and urgency that we were fighting Governor Hogan, we need to do the same thing, right? And keep that energy up and not imagine that things are magically going to pass. So with that said, I think that those are some of the things we're thinking about this session, and really excited to, I will share some information at the end for anyone who's interested in joining some of these upcoming lobby nights, who is connected to Black immigrants in your area, folks who need legal assistance outside of the legislative work. We offer a variety of different services, so excited to share some of that as well.
Quick housekeeping note. If you are parked in front of someone's driveway in this alley right here, please move your car across the street. You're blocking folks in. If you are parked in front of someone's driveway, folks are trying to get out, get on with their Saturday, please, we ask that you move your car across the street. You're blocking some folks in. We're going to go turn our direction back to the panel. That way we're going to see you putting yourself out. This is church, so go ahead and hold one finger. Walk on out like you need to. So let's make sure everybody can move as they need to today. I want to come back, Zakiya, to you. And your organization, Racial Justice Now, is working on some things this coming session that maybe you left on the table in 22, or maybe there's some things you haven't yet mentioned. What are those things that you're working on? And do any of those things sync up with some of the things we've heard today thus far?
Yeah, so we see our role on the state level as mostly monitoring and supporting a lot of the work that really the expert panel here who actually, live in Annapolis and do a lot of work there. As I mentioned before, education justice is something that's really important for us. So it would be good, for us to, see what happens there in terms of this new governor. I don't share the same level of excitement. And it's not necessarily personal. It's just that lots of times I know that, for Black folks and, the Democratic Party does a good job of, selecting leadership for us. And quite honestly, historically, if we, kind of do a careful analysis and kind of take emotion out of it, sometimes things actually get worse for Black people under certain leadership. So I'm cautiously, hoping things, do move forward. And again, because, with the way that our organization works, I'm concerned about interests that disproportionately impact Black folks particularly. One thing that I wanted to, mention is that I think that is important is that when it comes to school discipline issues, I think there is a lot of education or there should just be a lot more public education on that. Because I feel like a lot of people in the community, especially if you don't have kids in school anymore, we have no clue what's happening to our kids in these schools outside of, like the state report cards and things like that. But our children are really in crisis. And, it's not just a Baltimore issue. I mean, I don't know if folks have been hearing about this, but one statistic that blew my mind that I learned recently is that Montgomery County has the highest suicide rate for teens in the entire state of Maryland. And lots of Black children in Montgomery County over this last year and a half have committed suicide. And I don't see a lot of conversation, about that, partly because I think there's some shame there, sometimes when that happens and people, thank you. The families are reluctant, to come forward and ask for support. So I just kind of want us, to be thinking about, that and why these issues of schooling and, things like that are even more important, and why advocating for, just a broad set of, supports within our schools. I mean, the county has the money, but the state has the money too, we really have to advocate that they use these dollars instead of for criminalization and policing. Make sure that they're actually using these dollars for wellness, and making sure that the practitioners that, we're working with are not also, just replicating another harmful part of the state. Because one of the things that we were very clear about in Montgomery County is not just this bland counselors, not cops. No, we need particular types of therapists and counselors who also are not dealing with their own anti-Blackness, because the history of psychology and psychiatry in this country is horrific, like a whole bunch of other industries. I mean, these people called us crazy for trying to escape the plantation. I mean, so like, I just had to point that out. Like, that's, wild. And so you can see sometimes, even with a counselor, sometimes or social worker, if they're not culturally competent, especially if they're not coming from like an Afrocentric perspective, they sometimes replicate and sometimes do more harm. So those are just some things I didn't mention last time that I thought was critical. And finally, I have to say this, because I've been supporting LBS since I was living in Ohio. I'm not a native of Maryland at all. I'm sort of new here. Been here about 6 years now with my family. But I just want to say how grateful and thankful I am that we have a Black think tank. I see so many people across the country like, we need this, we need that. And I'm like, oh my God, it really exists in Maryland. So I'm grateful, for LBS and the important work that they do, not just here in Baltimore, but really for all of us across the state. And just want to encourage people, if you are not a sustainer, make sure you become a sustainer. I've happily been a sustainer, like I said, even before I moved to the state.
The Public Defender's Office, you guys are going to be doing some work. I know a lot of our conversation has been around criminal justice, although Reverend Slayton, you did censor us around the money that we need.
No, that's right.
And a lot of our conversations so far has been around criminal justice, but as we've heard from all the examples, we're the ones who are attacked by the criminal justice system, as some would call it, the criminal injustice system, right? So what is it that you all are looking to do this coming legislation?
Yes, no, absolutely. So we have a pretty broad legislative agenda, and that's because so many of our issues impact so many aspects of individuals' lives. It's not just about the charge, it's not just about the case. There are so many things across the spectrum, from pretrial to post-conviction to re-entry, that our office is engaged and involved with, and we see these problems on a daily basis that we want to address. And so one of our top priorities when we talk about, decriminalization and decarceration, we want to make sure that the legislator is not imposing additional laws and penalties and crimes. There are enough laws on the books that criminalize the people of Maryland, and we don't need any more crimes or penalties or enhancements put in place. We need to actually work to scale that back. We have to start looking at ways that we can again, turn away from the criminal justice system to resolve our problems, which I'm so happy that we are talking about mental health, because again, mental health is a huge component of how things play out in our communities, in our lives, and in the criminal injustice system, in terms of how mental health is handled. But it really comes back to families, it comes back to communities, it comes back to not being afraid to acknowledge that your mental health needs to be supported. And so I think when I've represented clients, most of them have some type of aspect in their life that could benefit from mental health services, and that they have actually been denied that. I have a lot of Black young clients where they've told me that their parents, their family members said, no, you don't need that. That's a weakness. You're not going to get this because, that's just, you don't need that. We can deal with that ourselves. We can go to church, and it's really disheartening to see that our Black communities are depriving our own people of the ability to benefit our physical, mental health. And that's through making sure that we have the support systems in place. Yes, Black children do commit suicide at a very high rate that we do not talk about. And one of the things that we also don't talk about is, what does it look like when a child is depressed versus what does it look like when an adult is depressed? Children act out in anger. They act out in behavioral issues. And so when you have a child that is depressed, that behavior is actually then criminalized, because it's looked at as if that child is in need of criminal court intervention. That is not the answer. That is absolutely not the answer. We have to stop looking at the court system and the criminal justice system as resolving these problems, because children who are depressed, they need the support of the community. So mental health is a huge component of the public defender's office in terms of the things that we do, and making sure that people have the proper education, but they also have proper access to getting those treatments and services, whether they're in the community or they're incarcerated. Being incarcerated is a whole barrier to getting those services. And so we have to stop incarcerating people in the first place and really look at the root of the problem. So when we talk about decarceration, decriminalization, that is a huge component at scaling back what we've already done to harm these communities and harm generations of communities, of separating families, disconnecting communities, and creating a lot of stigma around, if you have a criminal record or if you're locked up, there is a disconnect in how that can actually damage communities and damage families. So we also have a parental defense division where we make sure that we are focused on preserving the family unit. So many kids are put into the foster care system, into the social service system, and that is another way that we're looking to the court system to resolve these answers. Why are we not investing in families and parenting to make sure that they have the resources that they need so that they're not being deemed as being neglectful parents? So those are really huge aspects of the work that we do. And so we really want to be supportive in making sure that we address all these issues across the spectrum. And so I'll end it there, but yes, thank you.
Dayvon, I want to wrap up this particular portion of the what are you working on with you? And I don't want to lean so much into what are you working on, not because it's a disrespect to LDS, but with Lawrence's presentation, we know your relationship with Senator Carter, and obviously you guys convening us all here now. All of these issues are issues you're working on. Y'all ever know somebody who says the thing out loud that needs to be said, but everybody feels it, but nobody's comfortable saying it? Dayvon, we're going to come to you for something, all right? Because, listen, brother, you've volunteered for that in your life, your whole life already. The part that we asked a lot of people already is, what are you working on and what's the opposition? We heard a lot of what we're working on. Dayvon, tell it like it is. Who's standing in front of us? Who or what? Or commit? And you don't have to, listen, I'm not asking you to make any enemies in Annapolis. I don't need you to name names. But what I do want you to be honest with all of us for is, if we are all supportive and encouraging about these ideas, then how come there's an opposition to it if it feels so common sense? And what can we do to organize around that, against that opposition?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that framing, bro, because I was already kind of thinking about going in that direction. Let me offer some what I would call macro political analysis and then drill down to how it applies to what we're talking about. As people of African descent, when we, the chattel slavery, the Maafa, that was an act of war against people of African descent. And the impact that it had on us is that it undermined our ability to practice sovereignty as a free people, right? To be able to determine our quality of life and the institutions that govern our lives. And for me, that's an important frame, because when we think about all of the tools that white civil society has used, the propaganda against people of African descent have real policy implications. And so I think it's important to have that frame. So one of the things that's been happening when you think about the Democratic Party, right, we're a captured electorate, right, where between the two parties, the Democratic Party is a space where there's the most wiggle room. And unfortunately, as a captured electorate, the party has made a determination. When you look around the country, you look at the 2020 election federally, nationally, a lot of the commentary that was given, and Lawrence, actually did a presentation about this a couple of years ago that I would recommend people check out, where people would say Black people saved democracy, because of, getting Biden elected. And in many, so let's set aside the save democracy thing. But the piece around how the Democrats were able to get Biden elected, that it wasn't increased Black turnout that did that in most cases. Georgia's actually a special case, and I'll get to that in a second. The Democrats have made a determination that if they're going to be electorally viable, that they're going to go for the suburbs. They're not looking to go, if you think about a place like Baltimore City, we tend to have very low voter turnouts, majority Black jurisdiction, right? And the same thing in Prince George's County. But what the Democratic Party doesn't do is they don't invest in enough resources for independent Black electoral machinery that will actually be able to set the agenda for the party in a way that would allow Black people to get the policy delivered to us to the extent that we benefit the Democratic Party. So there's been an intentional decision, I believe, to not focus on Black voters. And so this is why Georgia is important, right? And whatever we think about, Stacey Abrams in some way stepping away from the progressive agenda she started with in 2018, the impact of the work in Georgia in 2018 was building, autonomous Black electoral infrastructure that set the stage for the ability for Georgia to have a Black U.S. senator and have him accountable to a constituency that is majority Black, right? That's real political leverage. But the Democratic Party isn't saying we're going to go deeper in Detroit, because that's a swing state in Michigan that would benefit the Democrats, but they're not going to do that, right? They're not going to do that in Milwaukee. Wisconsin's a swing state. If they wanted to, they can make that a stronghold. They're not going to do that. Same thing for Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvania is always a swing state. They could go deeper in Philadelphia. They're not going to do that. They're not going to invest in the infrastructure that would allow Black people to exercise the leverage needed for us to be able to wield that kind of power. That translates in many ways to the state of Maryland, because in many ways, the Democratic Party in the state of Maryland prioritizes the suburbs. How does that show up in policy? So some of the things that everyone mentioned, and acutely, particularly some of the things that Yanet and I have worked on as it relates to cannabis and the criminal justice aspect of it and public safety. With the rise in, over the past couple of years of homicide and violence in our communities, right? There's a tendency to have a rightward swing towards law enforcement-centric approaches to public safety. With that is a capitulation to those suburbs that have internalized notions of anti-Blackness, right, and an inherent criminality. There's a study, The Essence of Innocence. So a lot of what Crystal mentioned about the way in which young Black people are treated like adults in ways that white children are not. The Essence of Innocence, actually, they did a study where they looked at the way that people react to Black youth and white youth. And what they found was that Black youth were treated 6 to 10 years older than their actual age, right? That's because of the societal propaganda about anti-Blackness and inherent criminality. And so you have, right, by white and Black people, right? That's the societal projection that people have of Black youth. So the reason why, in terms of thinking about the suburbs as the Democratic Party's base, because they're appealing to a base that's scared of Black people, right? Whether it's white folks that live out there or many of the people who move there because of the anti-Black attitudes they have coming from places like Baltimore City, right? And this isn't like people have different reasons for why they move when they move. So this isn't, I'm not making a blanket statement, but just describing the politics that the Democratic Party pursues as it relates to what it prioritizes. So to the question, why is it so difficult to pass these pieces of legislation? Whenever you're talking about Black people, in many ways, Baltimore City is the poster child for this in Annapolis. The unspoken thing of Baltimore being a Black hole, right? And that even extends, and this is in ways that, our friends in Prince George's County may not like to admit openly, but that attitude is carried about Prince George's County as well. We see that through Delegate Marian Lasante with how she described, Prince George's County as a nigger district, right? So that very mentality, she didn't resign. So I think she got reelected. She was reelected. And so when we think about who is stopping this kind of policy, the policy that we discussed for moving forward, it is a constituency. So, Yanet mentioned the fraternal order police, but they are a part of a larger ecosystem of, a corporate, conservative donor class and its, subsidiaries, whether it's the Greater Baltimore Committee, which historically has pushed back against things that are good for Black people. So these are the kinds of we fought against the bail industry in the past. So these are major industries that have an interest in Black suffering because, again, they're capitulating to a base that carries very conservative anti-Black notions that then show up in the kinds of policy. It extends to immigration, right? Where many of the anti-Black notions that are projected onto Black people, projected on the brown people result in the idea that we don't want them around, right? So I wanted to raise that as a general frame to think about why would it be so hard? And we see it in committee. So for instance, if you think about the Judicial Proceedings Committee, where, that's a place where a lot of the criminal justice related stuff goes. And, you have Republicans that are openly using the language. The last thing I'll say on this point, even though Republicans are openly using the language, and I actually appreciate it.
Me too.
I actually appreciate, Bob Casserly and Mike Huff, they say it. But the biggest challenge is the spinelessness of the Democrats that are in position to move things beyond where they need to move. And so a part of the challenge, like when we think about some of the policies that we've been trying to push for a few years, I would argue, the chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, Will Smith, a brother from Montgomery County, and I would argue that, in terms of pushing these issues, I think he would say in a conversation he's sympathetic, but in terms of actually using his power to push it through, to usher it through, he hasn't demonstrated a capacity to do that. And I would argue that that's the case when we talk about historically been the case in terms of Democratic Party leadership. And so that's why it's important for people to really hold elected officials accountable because it's, again, the Republican opposition, the right-wing opposition, the fraternal order police that's there, but it's just the ineptitude and the lack of will, I think, from leadership of the Democratic Party. And again, it goes back to the base that they're actually trying to speak to. They're speaking to a base that's scared of Black people and that sees Black people as an impediment to the quality of life they want to maintain.
Like choosing between the devil and the deep blue sea. So I'm going to go to some of our questions that we got from the audience, and I thank you all, even those that are streaming. I have some of your questions. If I do not get your question specifically, it is because it overlaps with another question someone else asked, and I want to try to loop those in together. For our panel, I may address it to one person. If you want to add and think that you have something that you can contribute that was not addressed, please, 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 I invite you, welcome to jump in. If not, I'll move on to another. So again, we Black, y'all know how to do this, man. Don't act like y'all ain't played double dutch before. All right? So we're gonna do it this way. So I want to start because we've heard the question of mental health time and time again. Crystal, I'm gonna come to you about this. And even Zakiya, I think you had mentioned counselors, not cops, if I'm not mistaken. But some of us may recall back in 2016 in Florida, the therapist Charles Kinsey was shot by police when he was coming to tend to his autistic patient who he feared would be shot by police. And when he asked the police officer, "You shot me, why did you shoot me?" The officer replied, "I don't know." Initially, on the first charge, that officer was found not guilty. On the second charge, there was a hung jury. They retried him. The first charge again was found not guilty. The second charge was found guilty, but that was overturned. And my curiosity is, if we have all of this in place, all of this infrastructure in place, and we say, hey, let's attend to mental health services, and we attend to mental health services, and they shoot our mental health professionals, right? So we've now moved the victim from those who may be suffering from the immediate action of mental health to mental health professionals. I'm curious, and I'm going to wrap a couple of questions into one. One, what policies relating to mental health should we focus on? And then with that, how do we ensure that those mental health professionals who are delivering mental health services to our community have, I think the skeptical language now is the cultural competency to address us, serve us in ways that benefit us?
Yeah, and that's definitely a broad question. I'm going to do my best to answer it. So, you know, mental health and the criminal justice system are so intertwined. You know, we talked about it, but what we also need to talk about is, as you mentioned, representation within the mental health community. There are a lot of services that are available to certain communities, and there are a lot of professions that are available to certain communities, but they don't particularly connect to, you know, Black communities and Black children and Black families. And so that has turned a lot of people away from reaching out and getting those services and help. So we need more people to be representative of the communities that they are serving. And so we also need more investment, more resources. When we talk about funding, you know, when we look at the Public Defender's Office, we have services in place that we can connect people to, that we help people make sure that they have those resources. But as an agency, we are deemed as an indigent defense agency, essentially. And so we are typically underfunded, yet police is overfunded, state's attorneys, you know, they have funding, all these other entities and agencies have funding. But when you look at the Public Defender's Office in terms of the services that we provide and that we want to provide, we are wholly underfunded in that capacity and that ability. And then the blame is often put on us, you know, in our inability to do the work that we need to do to the best of our abilities. But we really have to look at investment in the right places, in the right communities, and in the right people. But yes, we also need to hold people accountable. That includes ourselves. So much of the Black community, we have to look at how we are thinking about, how we are viewing problems and how they need to be resolved. You know, when Dayvon mentioned, you know, the statistic about how young Black children are viewed as, you know, older than they actually are, and I said to him, that includes Black people viewing your own child or your own children in your community as older and as more culpable than white children. And so we really have to check our own biases, our own paradigm of how we look at young people within our community, but also how we look at mental health problems and trauma and how trauma plays out into violence. We have to address trauma at the root if we want to address violence as the outcome. I'm sorry? Yes, thank you. Lead poisoning. And then when I speak about physical, mental, and social health, the physical health, I am talking about all the disparities that go on in Black communities. And absolutely, lead paint has been a dramatic issue that has impacted so many young people. And then it's generational. But almost all, I'm not going to say all my clients, but so many of my clients, one of the we do for every single one of our clients is we ask for those lead records, because typically there's going to be some evidence of lead poisoning within our clients and how it's impacting their behaviors, how it's impacting their decision-making, how it's impacting their ability to comprehend instructions and compliance with rules and authority. And so we have to look at these problems as not kids who are unable to follow rules or, you know, that have authority problems, but these are kids that have physical, mental, emotional problems that need to be addressed. And so the policies that need to be put in place need to address all of the root problems that I'm speaking about, but it also comes to addressing our own biases and how we think about them in our own community and how we're treating them within our own community. So representation, investment, and checking our biases are things that, as a broad scope, within the public defender's office, we are addressing those through specific legislative pieces. And again, we have a full legislative agenda. I'm happy to give that to folks beyond this conversation, but I think these points are really important to address.
And then we'll come back down this way, Cathryn and Zakiya.
Yeah, just real quick, in addition to that, when we talk about funding, a lot of the human social service sector is an industry that people profiteer off of. So there are people who are part of their business plan is providing services to our community. And so it's really important that we uplift organizations and individuals in our community that are providing services. So like one of the reasons we thought it was important to have Bloom present this morning is because, there's a lot of conversation around reproductive justice. And we want to make sure that organizations like Bloom, give the proper regard and access to resources to do that work. I want to shout out my brother, Bobby Marvin Holmes, who is with the Association of Black Social Workers. So that's another organization and formation that's going to be important to support. So if there are formations that are providing those services, that are Black people providing them, that have the appropriate perspective, it's extremely important that we support them in their access to resources to provide the kind of services in our community.
I just wanted to reflect really, really broadly because I talked earlier about opening up Medicaid and the ACA and other public benefits. When we think about public benefits, we think about like the basics, right? The bare necessities we need for survival. And when we look at immigration campaigns, I've worked on a lot of different campaigns around detention centers and policing and so many other issues. The most difficult campaigns to pass are ones to expand public benefits. And I think it speaks to how deeply they don't want people to survive. That is our biggest advocacy fight. And so, and this includes the EITC bill that we talked about, right? Public benefits. The fight to keep people from public benefits is the fight to keep people from surviving.
I wanted to go back to the mental health piece. I think it's important when we talk about mental health within the Black community that we have to deal with the historical perspective, and we have to include clearly anti-Blackness and the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness and white domination and white supremacy. I believe that we need a similar approach that Lawrence talked about earlier in terms of having access to the resources to take care of our own. I actually think Black people should not be even dealing with mental health, institutions that don't have that analysis. I think we need our own institutions similar to the one that is a beautiful institution out in Oakland, Dr. Wade Nobles, who's actually one of the founding members of the Association of Black Psychologists, who they specifically use an African-centered lens to our healing and specifically incorporate the anti-Blackness and white supremacy that actually influences our mental health issues. We know that there are Black folks who are anti-Black is because we live around it. We're socialized that way. When anti-Blackness is not just socialized in the white people, it's socialized in us too. So that's why you have a lot of folks who, will replicate the same systems and you'd be like, oh, but they Black. It's like, okay, no, but they haven't done the work. We haven't done the work really on a grand scale across the country. Is done in smaller places in certain areas, but I think that's where we should start, is advocating for the resources that we need to build our own institutions. I can't argue that enough. I know that might be uncomfortable for some Black people and stuff, but I think at this point we have seen the evidence, y'all. It's up to us. We really do need to start creating and sustaining our own institutions, or we're going to be on this panel every year talking about the same thing over and over and over again. And so I think that it's been time to get serious about creating our own institutions, but also if we're gonna keep voting for the Democratic Party, I think it's time for us to demand reparations, not just, in the cannabis area, but really in all areas of our life. So that's what I wanted to add.
Cathryn, I think this one it feels pretty particular to you, so feel free to start with us. How does the repair or reparation piece of cannabis, how would that affect and address issues in the immigrant community? How do we look at the question around cannabis and reparation and justice around cannabis? How do we look at that and then also consider that within the immigrant community?
Well, let me let Yanet start us off.
Okay.
Well, one thing I'll say is that, and I appreciate this question, is that the needs are different for those who are going to go through immigration proceedings, especially when we talk about redress for the harm of the war on drugs. So simply expunging possession or previous marijuana-related convictions is not enough for the immigrants. They need opportunities for vacature, and vacature goes a step further than expungement. It actually undoes the adjudication, so it removes the guilty finding. And that's important because marijuana is still illegal on the federal level, and that's where we deal with immigration. And so we haven't done that yet. So we actually haven't addressed solutions for people going through immigration proceedings to have actual relief for the harm of the war on drugs. And then moving forward, going back to what I mentioned earlier about the criminal penalties, that there are more desperate impacts on people who are going through immigration proceedings, because that could end up you being deported for even possession. And that includes, and as Kat mentioned earlier, dealing with ICE and the police when you're Black and Black immigrant. And so when we talk about the reparations piece, part of the pushback that we get a lot about even vacature is there's no funding to do these things. So maybe that's some of the things that these communities can explore when that money comes back into their communities, and that's one opportunity. And we'll leave it there.
Yeah, so to give an example, say you are applying for citizenship, right? And you have a charge on your record that you may not want to apply for citizenship, because that means when you go in and do your interview, that not only may you be denied, right, but your actual legal status will be in question, right? So you could lose your permanent status and possibly risk deportation. And so removing that in a way that doesn't inhibit the way that you file your application is so, so critical, right? And obviously I'm using citizenship as an example, but really in any type of case or petition that you file.
I just want to add something in terms of the money component. When we're talking about the ability to invest in certain programs and invest in our communities, we have to look at what is draining our community, what is taking a toll on the ability for us to invest. The money's there, but it's being drained in ways that, such as court fees, electronic monitoring fees, all these things, taking people's license away. There are so many things that are draining funds out of our communities that we have to address in terms of legislatively and policy-wise. So we have to make sure that we're looking at everything and every aspect of how we are able to invest and go into the right resources, because Maryland has money. It's about reallocating and rethinking where the money is being taken from so that folks actually have the ability to do the things they need to do.
Go right ahead.
I would add to that as well, as we mentioned earlier about the tool that you have. If you look at this year's projected budget, look at maybe $55 billion, right? So for the first issue on mental health, you know that the largest bulk of money is going to be spent, almost $19 billion, where? In healthcare. The unique tool you have this year, unlike you've had before, is now you can push your legislators where they say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. That's just the way it is. Now the tool in your arsenal is say, hey, we want you to look at sort of moving and shifting these things here, back to here to do this. You have a new tool that you can use to push those folks that you send there to really try and address an issue that you have budgetary.
Dayvon, I'm gonna ask you this because I think we can get it quickly and then move to some of the other questions from the audience. There are folks who want to know, when Senator Carter was here talking earlier about judicial elections, folks are eager to be a part of our democracy, But how in the heck am I supposed to know which judge is going to send me and my nephew up the road for the next 14 years versus which one is going to be the one who points me toward diversion tactics? Is there a place, a centralized hub where I could get that kind of information? Or what is the community resource where those of us who want to be informed about that kind of thing? Because again, some of us may have filled out ballots recently and said, Judge, I don't know, I'll pick anybody. How do we, and that may be then used by the legislature to say, see, we should better appoint them. How do we keep informed about the judges in order to be active in our democracy on that?
So I'll say two things. The first is that the answer to the question is no, there isn't a repository with that information, and we desperately need that. And for folks to step up and to do that kind of analysis, all of that stuff is public information. It's just the issue of compiling it. It's, it takes a lot. And to the point that she made, that Senator Carter made about the assault on electing judges, I think it's important to keep in mind that when we think about in Annapolis, the past couple of sessions since the pandemic, there's been more access for people to see what happens in committees and see what happens in Annapolis in a way that wasn't as accessible in the past. So I think it's really important for people to take advantage of that. And I would argue other advocacy organizations, one of the things that we do is sometimes we'll take clips of things that happen and put it up. And it's good because I think for a lot of people, if you don't see it, it isn't as real, And actually I would argue one of the biggest impacts of this was that during the 2021 General Assembly, working on policing, the Judicial Proceedings Committee and the Vice Chair, Senator Wallstriker, voted with Republicans to strip it of community oversight, right? And that was something that really, I would argue, has now pushed him in a position where he's going to have to make up for that. You know what I mean? Because there are a lot of people in his jurisdiction, in his constituency, that were upset about that. But people, if you didn't see it, it may not have had the impact that it had. So I think it's important for people to compile some of that information. The second thing I want to say, this is probably to the democracy point, and this is actually borrowed some from what Rev just said. Baltimore City and the state of Maryland, in terms of the relationship between its executive and legislature, is what's called a strong executive system, right? Where in Baltimore City, a lot of the power is concentrated in the mayor, and the council doesn't have very much power. And similarly, on the state level, governor presents the budget, legislature approves it up and down. I know on the city council level, they could strike a thing from a budget but couldn't add. And what's interesting is that in both cases, both locally and on the state level, as Rev said, the council in the context of the local government and legislators from the state government are going to be able to now add or propose additional budget items. That's pretty tremendous, right? Because I would argue that when you think about in the 60s and 70s, the emergence of Black mayors around the country, I think many Black people who were engaged in Black liberation would argue that Black people coming to power as mayors was really important in terms of Black political power. I think the 40 or 50 years or so has shown us that the concentration of power in one Black mayor has been circumvented, and the corporate sector has been able to essentially capture our Black elected officials and have them operate against our interests. So one of the best checks against that is to have a more empowered legislature to check the executive. And so that particular tool, I think, is something that is important for us to utilize. I would argue, for LBS, our work on the Lawrence mentioned the Youth Fund, which is the $12 million a year fund specifically for children and youth, programs that serve children and youth. Majority of the organizations that were funded by it are Black-led. Its leadership is majority Black. I mention it because we were able to do that because it was a charter amendment, which required the council to sign off. It wasn't a traditional allocation from the mayor. If you know about the Board of Estimates, you get 5 votes on the Board of Estimates, but the mayor controls 2 of the votes of the 5. So it's essentially all the spending goes through the mayor, right? So it's the mayor, city council president, comptroller, director of Department of Public Works, and city solicitor. The mayor appoints the director of the Department of Public Works and the city solicitor. So in essence, it's 3 votes of 5, right? So a more empowered legislature provides an opportunity for the community to do that. And I mentioned that because Yanet mentioned the police accountability boards and the policing stuff. We thought it was important that the police accountability board constitution had to come through the council. Similarly, as we mentioned with the reparations fund, that come through the local counties, because that's going to give local people a greater opportunity to impact the budget. So I just wanted to make that broader point that the tool that Rev mentioned is something that I think is going to be very important for people to utilize.
And Rev has a point. Go ahead and get to Rev, and I'll go ahead and queue up the next question while we do that.
I just wanted to add to your question about how do we know what judges to select. Just to put it in historical perspective, Baltimore City elected its first citywide elected person in 1968, Judge Joseph Howard. And the tool that was used was, ironically, the Black church. The Black church broke all the rules. And as you went to your particular church on that Sunday, they thought there was no way Judge Howard would win, but you opened up your worship guide, and I've actually seen the actual hand card. It was a bullseye. And they told all their congregants when they leave that they were to single shoot. They could vote for 3 judges, but they voted for 1. The answer to the question is sort of restoring that trust and who gives that to us. I think a part of our being here is that LBS has demonstrated that they are a trusted member of our community. And if it comes to positions like that, we should look to them.
Rev, hold the mic for a second because, I'm sorry, I want to get another question in real quick. And I think the Center for Maryland Economy might be best to give us some ways to think about this. But we've talked a lot about reparations money and about cannabis money. How does affordable housing tie into the funding that comes along with that we anticipate from cannabis and reparation money there? What connection can we make there? What connection should we be trying to make there?
There are serious connections there. Unfortunately, I am not the first to answer it. Maybe there's somebody on this panel who can.
We appreciate an honest service, don't we?
I would say 2 things. One is I think the progressive taxation that I know the Maryland Center for Economic Policy focuses on when we talks about the ways in which corporations and wealthy individuals avoid paying into the public system to be able to provide some of these resources. And so I think one general piece is making sure that we're able, in a Democratic controlled legislature with a Democratic governor, we should be able to move on some of these policies so that there's more revenue that comes from taxing the wealthy and those big corporations. So that's one. In terms of cannabis, each jurisdiction, as Lawrence mentioned, and Zakiya and I, we're going to talk more about this because this is something that we actually thought was pretty astonishing. I'm not sure that many of the jurisdictions in the state know about the provision that passed the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund, and that it requires local legislation to establish it. And so I'm saying that to say that in all the different jurisdictions, it's going to be, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, all these different jurisdictions, it's going to be important that folks like the folks here and the folks that are sympathetic to the perspective that we demonstrated here are the ones that are driving the distribution of those resources. And so housing being one of those issues, and not just housing broadly, but in terms of doing housing in a way that's actually empowering. I'll give an example, because one of the things that we partner with ACLU of Maryland and their national office is the development of a toolkit that's going to be made available for people in other jurisdictions. And using housing as an example, oftentimes when we talk about providing housing, we're just talking about putting people in a place for them to live. But I think it's also important to include, well, what are the companies and organizations that are going to be building the housing if it's new housing, or managing it, to make sure that not only are we talking about placing people in homes, but it's also an opportunity for resource and wealth accumulation for our community. And that's something when we use the framework of reparations, it's important why, it's a reason why for us, reparations as a frame is so important. Because government is so used to thinking about distributing money based on providing services, which is important, but not enough about how to invest in building the kind of civic, social, financial machinery needed to move large sums of public dollars from government to the ground to the community. And so the cannabis, the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund is an opportunity for people to shape it in a way that reflects those values.
Hold the mic for me for 1 second, Dayvon, and I'm going to stall because I'm going to allow our panel to give us one last thought. So on behalf of their organization, perhaps individually, whatever it is they want us in the audience and us watching and stream whenever we watch, to gear up for the legislative session and think about whatever the takeaway that you think is most vital. I want you all to share that with us. Dayvon, we're going to start with you. We're going to work our way down. This, in the business, is what we call filling. We filled because I just put them on the spot. They didn't know they were going to have one last time to say a thing. So I say some words out loud, and then these folks can have some time to think about it. For the audience in attendance, I do want to let us know, although I may not have gotten to everyone's question, when we break from this does not necessarily conclude the entirety of our event. Y'all see, we still got some snacks left, right? We still got some water left. And this is an opportunity for us to converse and mingle one-to-one. If there was something that you heard you want to build upon, if there was some expertise that one of our panelists communicated that you want to draw more from, because ideally, we would take this back to our communities, and then we become the expertise on questions of immigration. We become the experts on questions of repository of judicial information. We become the experts on taxation. We become the experts because we are the ones who are here. And those who are not here are every bit as important in our democracy and getting us to where we want to be as we are. But we need to get the information. And so if community and conversation is how we get that information over some delicious snacks, then that's how we will do that once we conclude the formal portion of our panel. And I want to invite us that if you did not hear your question asked, please do not feel as though it was not attended to. That is a wonderful time to come and have conversation with any of our experts. So with that said, Dayvon, would you begin with our closing remarks? And we're going to pass the mic and work it back down to Renaissance.
So first, I want to thank Ray for being such a great moderator. So let's just give him a round of applause for such a great job. What I would say is, one of the things that I have learned over my years doing legislative advocacy, the model that many of us are socialized to think is the most effective is having more proximity to leadership and those in power. It will define your ability to be effective. I think there are people who have, passed that down because that's how they've been able to get stuff done and been able, in some cases, to get, meaningful marginal gains. Some cases marginal, some cases meaningful. But one of the things that, in terms of the way that LBS has approached the work, for us, it's important that our power literally comes from our community, like our base of Black folks in our community. And a lot of times, when we do that or other organizations attempt to hold themselves accountable to Black people, oftentimes we are characterized as, rabble-rousers, troublemakers. But it's really important to note that there are also efforts to marginalize organizations that tend to do that work and tend to make the kind of arguments that we've made this afternoon. One of the things that I can say I'm extremely proud of is that over the years, LBS, given our strong base in our community, it's not a superficial thank you. We're really grateful for the opportunity that Black people have given us to do the work that we do and for that to be the power that drives us. And I'm saying that for the purpose of alerting people that, the work that is to be done, one can easily get excited or easily decide that we have a new governor, he's Black and he's a Democrat, and so things will be fine. And I would argue that there are actually folks in power who would prefer that Black folks take that approach. Right. I would argue, and I've heard some people argue that, like when Barack Obama became president, that many of the radical forces were demobilized, right? Because Barack Obama was understood to be, in some ways a panacea for Black people. And it's extremely important that as a community, we don't make that mistake. So it's extremely important, whether it's, Adam has mentioned, becoming a sustainer for LBS.
Become a sustainer, give us money, thank you.
Become a sustainer. Even if you can't become a sustainer, becoming on our mail list so that you can call your legislator. As Senator Carter said, those calls and emails make a huge difference. I know that when we put on a call and a legislator is in our crosshairs, I'm more likely to get a meeting, right? I'm more likely to be in a position of negotiating. And over the past several years, we've experienced an ability to drive policy in a way that, no explicitly Black nationalist organization, typically is in a position to argue on high-level policy at the level that we're able to. And that's only possible because of the support we get from the community. And so I want to encourage you all, and not just LBS, you have folks up here that are doing amazing work that, we partner in a variety of ways. And so to whatever extent you can to support, whatever it's financially or coming to Annapolis on hearing days, sending communication to your legislator, that is how we're able to wield the kind of power that leadership can't control. And unfortunately, people who traditionally have taught, who learned to do this work, being proximate to leadership, oftentimes when they hit that ceiling, where leadership ultimately says no, if you don't have a power base, you're limited to what leadership tells you can do. And fortunately for us, we're not limited by any leadership, and allows us to be able to do the work we do. So thank you.
So yes, first of all, I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists and everybody here. So we have done some incredible work through the Public Defender's Office by, working with other individuals, working with other coalitions, working with other advocacy groups, because it's important that we all come together and we all have a voice and we all have a contribution to what needs to change and how we view that change and how it needs to be done. So everybody needs to come together in terms of being a contributing participant in how our laws are being made and how our laws are going to actually impact our communities. So I just want to make sure that everybody is recognized for all the hard work that they do and coming together and making sure that we are working together towards a common goal. But in terms of the Public Defender's Office, we definitely want to make sure that you see us as somebody that you can come to, whether you have somebody that is impacted by the criminal justice system, or you just want to be a part of change so that we are not looked to, we are not viewed as the agency for all the answers that need to be resolved by the community. Of course, we want to help, we want to do all those things, but we need to look at how we are investing in our communities and looking at how we are changing the way that criminal justice is viewed and public safety is viewed. There have been so many times when I have been in a courtroom, the judge is Black, prosecutor's Black, sheriff deputies are Black, defendants Black, and there is a tough on crime mentality that has to change. So it doesn't matter how many, people we put on the bench or in places of power that look like us. If we don't change the way we think about how we're operating within the justice system, it's not going to change. So as a part of the Public Defender's Office, that is a huge component of what we do, is trying to help people rethink and educate them on what it means to actually have health, wellness, and safety. It does not mean that you lock them up and you keep them separated from their communities. So it's just rethinking that, and we encourage you to do that. We encourage you to reach out to us if you have ideas, if you have things that you want to work on. We are open and welcome, and we absolutely encourage that. It is your voice, it is your power that will make the change through the legislature, because it ultimately impacts you. Thank you.
Well, I didn't get a chance to talk about this earlier, so really quick, I want to mention that there are a lot of local fights across the board to get rent stabilization. And so hopefully when we have time afterwards, folks who are interested in that tenant organizing can support that. Rent, I think someone came into our office the other day whose rent had increased by 35%. It's crazy. It is crazy. And so I just want to uplift, because I didn't mention that earlier, that continuing to do tenant advocacy, specifically capping rent. There's a lot of pandemic emergency rent stabilization bills that passed. We're working to get those permanent. So if there's folks who are interested in that, that's definitely a top priority of CASA. In terms of closing remarks, I guess I just want everyone to really, as you see immigration being talked about, and as you see immigration bills come before us, that we really think about how it impacts us, right? And really take ownership of that issue as an issue that impacts our community very deeply. And then finally, I guess the big picture that I would like to urge everyone to just keep in mind is what moment in history that we're in. And it's not because Wes is our first Black governor, right? But it's because things are shifting politically, right? And we have, because Wes is our first Black governor, we have a lot of national attention on Maryland right now. And so now is the time for us to be louder than we ever have before, while the entire nation is watching us, right? And make sure that people are clear on what the people are asking for, right? That they're not just worried about what Wes is saying in his press conferences, but that they're really clear on the national level about the dynamics and the asks that we have politically. And so I would say, like I said earlier, we have to work harder than ever and be louder than ever. So thank you guys.
I just want to, echo and retweet what Dayvon said because it's so critical. When we operate from that perspective of, just from a defensive instead of being accountable to the people and fighting for what is actually going to bring change to the community, it's the people that suffer the consequences. And so we always, always, always have to be centering the needs of the community. And the other thing I'll just selflessly plug in, we have on December 17th, our Grassroots Lobby Day, where we'll go more in depth about some of the legislative priorities that I mentioned today and roll out some of our other ones. And additionally talk about how it is that, what does it look like supporting these issues during session, one-on-one teach-ins, how to meet with the legislators and stuff like that. So if that's something you all are interested in, please join us on the 17th. It is a virtual event, so you can tune in from wherever. And I'll end on this note, and it's a quote from Kwame Ture on one of his speeches titled "Who's Qualified?" And that is, "The status quo persists because there is no ways up from the bottom. When improvements within the system have been made, they resulted from pressure from below. Nothing is given away. Governments don't hand out justice because it's the nice thing to do. So it is in our hands, and it's critical that we invest in educating ourselves, but also our community and organizing. That is the only way that we'll be able to actually make deep, lasting, impactful change and actually challenge white supremacy." Thank you.
Short and quick, it's always good to be amongst these wonderful folks doing work in Annapolis. If you want to know more about what we do, you can visit our website at rjndnv.org. That is rjndnv.org. And yeah, we'll just be, certainly following the leadership of LBS in terms of the things that we'll be supporting at the state level this year. Thank you.
Thank you to LBS, the persons on the panel. I encourage you all to truly find a way to support this organization. There's no way for me to sort of detail how important their presence is in that space during that 90 days. They don't write large checks to elected officials, so that limits certain accesses, but it's the power of their sheer confidence to stand on a truth and a love of their people. And there's no way to really sort of show that back other than one, become a sustainer, and two, supporting the work that they do. Public policy and the impact of it changes everything about our community. Dr. King said, I can't legislate for folks, to be kind to me, but I can pass laws to keep them from knocking the hell out of me. The presence of LBS is literally, boots on the ground, doing work that many of us, and sadly to say, the faith community, the Black church, is not in a space to do anymore the way we used to. So I encourage you to do them the justice of supporting them. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say, church starts at 10:30 in the morning. I hope you will join us.